Audiobook title, Caledon's Fall, 166 to 185, by T.G. Parsons, Chapter 166, War, Part 4, Chapter 166, Celestial Devastation. Cal shouted, and the reactor deep within the Atlas began to spin rapidly. The cockpit was filled with a whirling noise as it powered to its limit. Reaching out with both hands, Cal directed Atlas to unleash the attack on the millions of Vor racing toward the line of human defenders. They had created a massive breach in the ground miles away from defenders, their claws digging into the metallic plates and ripping them away to widen the hole until it was nearly a mile in diameter. A wave of increased gravity expanded out from the front of the Titan, hundreds of times greater than the Terran normal. It pressed down on the stones and metal of the shattered building, grounding them to dust as it tore forward like an ocean wave. When the gravity undulations reached the Vor, they were flattened and pulverized into a paste. Nothing was left in the wake of the increased gravity but a smear that had once been the Vor forces assaulting them. Unlike the last time Cal used this technique, he was entirely in control of Atlas. He felt none of the effects of the attack. The gravity remained the same in the cockpit, and he was completely unharmed. "Thank you, Duke Caledon, we can handle things from here." The Imperial Guard commander for this sector of the city spoke as his troops secured the area. Engineers were already hard at work reinforcing the defenses for the next assault. "I'll leave you to it then. The plan is to retreat and blow this section within the hour. Let's make them pay for every inch." Cal replied as the Atlas took to the skies. It was time for him to take a rest, leaving the guard to mine the sector while he caught his breath. The original plan had called for the Titans to only respond to the most dire of situations or if a Monarch variant Vor appeared, but that hadn't taken into account the sheer ferocity of the Vor forces. Cal had been called upon multiple times to rescue trapped guard troops or hold off an assault while reinforcements were brought from another sector, and it had only been a few hours since the attack began. Could they hold for the time it would take to detonate the Dyson Sphere? Atlas was nearly back to the Silver Pyramid that served as their base of operations when an urgent communication came through his private channel. "Caledon, get over to the eastern sector, now!" Yanis shouted. His face appeared on Cal's HUD. Pale white and covered in sweat, the veteran pilot looked rattled. "On my way." "What is it?" Cal asked, turning immediately toward the east and pushing Atlas to its maximum velocity. "We've got our first Monarch." "Hurry." I don't know how long the communication abruptly ended, and Yanis Samira's face disappeared from Cal's HUD. Ignoring the worry that began to worm its way through his stomach, he focused on flying. He just hoped he made it in time. Page break. Damn it all. We're cut off, but Caledon is on his way. Hopefully, the three of us will be enough. Yanis cursed, closing the communication panel and returning his attention to the battle around them. Things were looking grim. Yanis had come to the eastern sector to relieve Praxis. The Earl had been burning through his foes for nearly an hour, unleashing firestorms to drive back the Vor when it seemed they would gain the upper hand. Of all the Titans, Prometheus seemed like the perfect counter to the hordes of Vor. Its flames burned them away by the thousands, and the lingering fires made it possible for the troops of the eastern sector to take a breather for a few minutes before the next attack. But even a Titan needed a break, and Yanis had been tasked with taking over for the Early while the latter returned to the pyramid to rest. But Yanis had barely reached the eastern sector when a section of ground hundreds of miles in diameter shattered, sending debris flying into the sky before raining down on the waiting mobile suits. An enormous figure floated out of the gap through the yawning chasm that led directly to the void. The creature was humanoid, with an elongated skull that curved backwards. Its grayish skin was smooth, and its face lacked a mouth. It had two narrow slits for a nose, and its eyes glowed a bright red against the darkness of space. One of the Vor Monarch's forearms was outstretched while the others rested at its sides. It was clothed in flowing black liquid and seemed to be cloaked in a darkness that billowed in the wind that rushed through the opening it had created. The creature could fly, although there was no visible means of propulsion holding it aloft. It was as if gravity did not affect it at all. Behind the Monarch came a horde of Vor that numbered in the tens of millions, made up mostly of massive soldier variants. Even Yanis aboard his Titan paled at the forces arrayed against them. "We don't need the weaklings," we're more than enough to handle these beasts," Praxis said with conviction. The flames around Prometheus grew brighter as he prepared his attack. "We should wait," Yanis spoke before Praxis cut him off. "You can wait, coward. Leave this to me if you aren't man enough," Praxis shouted, and the Prometheus took off skyward while trailing bright orange and red fire behind it. "Burn in the fires of perdition," Praxis yelled, and the reactor of the Titan whined loudly. Gouts of fire emerged like wings behind the Titan. Sweeping forward, the intense flames swept across the ground, carried on even faster by the air rushing toward the breach in the sphere. The Vor in its path instantly disintegrated into white ash, but when they neared the monarch, they stopped. The Vor monarch had curiously watched the approaching flames, making an almost animal-like gesture of tilting its head to one side while the fires destroyed its comrades. When it came close, the monarch raised one of its hands, its grey palm making a halting motion toward the blazing inferno. "Die, you bastard!" Praxis shouted with glee as the fires neared the monarch, only to watch in horror as the blaze stopped moving. As if the flames obeyed the monarch's will, they halted before it. For a second, everything seemed to freeze, and then the Vor made a smothering motion with its palm, gesturing downwards toward the ground. The flames, hot enough to rival a sun, extinguished instantly. So powerful was the monarch that even the ground cased to smoke, leaving nothing but blackened concrete and metal behind. "That's impossible," Praxis muttered. How could this creature stop his flames with a single gesture? It was inconceivable. It didn't even seem to cause the monarch any strain or hardship to do so. Just how strong was this Vor variant? After smothering the flames, the monarch turned its attention to the flying Titan that had created them. Its other arm made a grasping motion toward the distant mobile suit. "Praxis, get out of there!" Yanis bellowed, but it was too late for Prometheus to move. As soon as the monarch gestured, Praxis felt a weight settle on the Titan. It was as if a giant hand had squeezed its way entirely around Prometheus, freezing it in place and restricting its movements. "Warning, structural integrity compromised. Warning, reactor overload imminent." The mechanical voice of the onboard computer spoke out in the cockpit. Praxis could see the terminal filled with notifications indicating the damage the Titan was receiving. "I'm not finished yet," Praxis warned, trying to activate the Titan's systems. But nothing was responding. Whatever the Vor monarch did to him, it restricted more than Prometheus' movements. "Hold on!" Yanis roared as Wraith shot toward the monarch. As it did so, millions of tiny, mosquito-like drones emerged from the hump on its back. Like glittering, metallic stars, they floated around the battlefield. Free from the burden of the drones, Wraith stood upright, pulling out a las rifle from a compartment. Yanis aimed at the Vor while shouting the activation command for Wraith's unique ability, Recollection of Massacre. Yanis ordered. Wraith, the Conjurer Recollection, used drones to recreate anything its pilot wanted. The things Wraith conjured were real rather than an illusion or false reality. In its database were recordings of every major conflict humanity had ever fought in, and it could bring those scenes into reality. The millions of small drones began to merge, and a shimmering field of energy formed around them. In moments, hundreds of mobile suits appeared out of nowhere, heavy class meshes in dozens of variants, all wielding powerful weapons, began to fire at the monarch. Assault ships, guided missiles, and even weapons technology not seen since the AI war was recreated by Wraith. Bluish-white streaks of lasgun energy, crimson PPC, nuclear warheads and conventional bombs flashed toward the monarch, and it was soon engulfed in a blinding flash of light from the sudden onslaught of Wraith's attack. Chapter 167, War, Part 5. Chapter 167. Praxis felt the monarch's control over Prometheus loosen as soon as the Vor disappeared in the blinding light of the onslaught of explosions Wraith had unleashed. The cacophony of thunderous lasgun fire and exploding missiles was deafening. Unlike Prometheus, which could destroy vast swathes of land and enemy forces, Wraith concentrated all of its firepower in a single area. When a mushroom cloud of dust, debris, and superheated air began to rise, another explosion would restart the entire process. Finally free of his restraints, Praxis laughed loudly as he witnessed the monarch be obliterated before his eyes. "Take that, You bastard, not so invincible now, are you? Praxis taunted, allowing his typical calm and in-control demeanor to lapse for the moment. Still, the damage had been done to his Titan, and it seemed that he would need to return to the Silver Pyramid for repairs. Hopefully, the Imperial engineers had the capabilities to fix Prometheus, or they would be down a Titan for this battle. Wraith allowed his illusions to still. Their attack ended as quickly as it began. I doubt anything could survive that. Yanis commented. Even a Titan would have been overwhelmed by the intense destruction he had wrought on such a limited area. Despite his words, he watched the still smoking location where he had last seen the monarch with a careful eye. I'll need to head back for repairs. Do you have this area under control? Praxis asked as he directed the Titan to drift closer to the ground. Yanis could see the damaged armor plates on Prometheus, and he guessed that the impairment to the Titan's system must be severe if Praxis was in such a hurry to return. I have everything in control. The conjuring can last for hours. And there's no. Yanis was cut off as something pierced the smoke and cloud of dust where the monarch had last been. It traveled so quickly that Praxis couldn't see what happened, only the result. A line of light was burned into his eyes. An afterimage of an attack. It split the distance between the cloud and Wraith in an instant, piercing through its cockpit with an ease that seemed unreal to the Earl. Wraith stood for a second, almost stunned by the unbelievable attack, before it crumpled to the ground. The conjured illusions faded away, and their mosquito-like drones dropped like puppets whose strings had been cut. Yanis? Praxis asked. Even with his experience in combat, he was confused by what happened. Nothing should have been able to pierce the shields and armor of a Titan with such ease. But the evidence was right in front of him. Something had pierced through the Titan's cockpit, instantly killing Yanis Samira. Praxis watched in horror as the smoke and dust cleared, revealing the monarch. It was whole and relatively undamaged. He could see traces of burns and cuts on its grey skin from where Wraith's attack had struck true, but it was relatively minor when compared to the loss of a Titan. The monarch's hand was still raised, its clawed finger pointing at where Wraith had been. Seeing the evidence of the Titan's demise, it slowly lowered its hand, while behind it, a wave of more war drones and soldiers climbed out of the rift. The flowing black liquid that shrouded the creature appeared to be significantly lessened than before. Praxis suspected it had something to do with how the monarch had shielded itself from the explosions. His guess was confirmed a moment later when the monarch waved its hand toward a group of Vor soldiers. The monsters staggered momentarily before collapsing into black liquid pooling along the ground. Praxis watched in horrid fascination as it crept along the ground and climbed the monarch's body, healing its wounds and replacing the shroud that it had lost. I'm no easy prey, monster. Praxis growled, and flames rushed out of the Prometheus, cloaking in an orange-red pillar of fire. Immediately, notifications sounded out in the cockpit, warning of irreparable damage and an overtaxed environmental regulation system unable to keep up with the intense heat being generated. Praxis silenced them with a thought. He knew that he wouldn't be walking away from this battle alive. Prometheus pushed off the ground, shooting toward the monarch on wings of fire. The Vor merely raised its arms, and a field of energy the likes of which Praxis had never seen before surrounded it. Shouting loudly, the Titan slammed into the barrier, and everything for hundreds of miles in every direction disappeared in an inferno. Page break. As Cal was speeding eastward, he saw what he mistakenly took as the rising sun for a moment before the reality of where he was struck him. A fireball hundreds of miles in diameter spread out from where he knew the Titans were fighting. With the light came a harsh wind of intense heat, and Cal was forced to ground Atlas to resist the storm winds. Digging the Titan's hands into a crevice between two metallic plates, he waited for the wind to subside gradually. Taking to the air once more, Cal was struck by the devastation in front of him. Most of the easter sector was gone. Nothing but a gaping void in the Dyson sphere remained. Some kind of defensive system the AI had left had engaged, forming a thin membrane over the rift, preventing the remaining atmosphere within the sphere from escaping. The troops that had been stationed here had retreated when the Titans began to fight, and thankfully they were not caught in the destruction. Flying over the rift, he saw no living beings, no Titans or Vor. Even in the space outside the sphere lacked the invading creatures. So intense were the flames that it must have driven them off temporarily. Caledon, backup will be arriving shortly. What is your status? Have you made contact with Praxis and Samira? Argyle asked. The communication link was filled with static, possibly a result of the devastation around him. Cal's sensors weren't picking up increased levels of radiation, but something was causing interference. Negative. Wraith and Prometheus are near, along with whatever they were fighting. I'll continue to look but hang on, I'm getting something. Cal stopped speaking once his HUD registered something metallic and large drifting through space outside of the sphere. Cal directed Atlas through the gap. The Titan easily pierced the barrier, preventing the atmosphere from rushing out. Once he was in the void, Cal sped toward the object his sensors had detected. It was the Prometheus, the little that remained of it. The Titan was missing all of its limbs and most of its head. The torso was relatively intact, although it was charred black from the fire. To Cal's surprise, he was receiving a life signal from inside, although it was faint. "I've found the Prometheus. Inform the medics that Praxis is in critical condition," Cal ordered, but he didn't get a response from his spotty communications. Gripping the remains of Prometheus in Atlas' claw hands, he flew back toward the Silver Pyramid while keeping an eye out for Wraith or the Vor Monarch they had been fighting. He saw neither, and a short time later, he landed in front of the pyramid, where a group of engineers and medics were waiting. Cal set the charred wreck of the Prometheus on the ground before climbing out of the cockpit to speak with Argyle. The prince had come rushing out of the pyramid as soon as Atlas was sighted, and his face was a mixture of shock and well-controlled fear. While the engineers worked on opening the cockpit, Cal relayed his findings to the prince. "This is a disaster," Argyle whispered, careful not to let many overhear his words. "One Titan incapacitated, another likely destroyed, all because of a single Monarch variant. Did you see any trace of the creature?" Argyle asked. "Nothing remained. We'll need the sensor data from Prometheus in order to assess the Monarch's abilities if we are to have any hope of stalling them long enough for the detonation to occur," Cal replied, and Argyle let out a deep sigh. "We'll be relying on you and the other Titans more than ever before this is over. We have 6 hours left. I pray that was the only Monarch we will be dealing with," Argyle replied before they were interrupted by a shout from the engineers. "Medics, he's in rough shape." The cockpit opened with a hiss of steam and smoke. Praxis was in critical condition, and the single glance of his figure by Cal before he was carried off let him know that the Earl was out of this fight, even if they could repair his Titan. "We'll send you the sensor data once we have it. Until then, guard the eastern sector, fall back to the next line of defense and hold for as long as you can," Argyle assured him. Taking a last look at the Prometheus, Cal nodded before climbing back into Atlas. Chapter 168, War, Part 6. Chapter 168. He's stable, but Prometheus is out of commission. The engineers say the reactor is undamaged, and the rest of it can be rebuilt with time and the proper facilities. But we're down to just the 4 of us. Cal explained to the others. "Our losses are going to be severe with us out of the fight." Patrick replied, shaking his head at their new orders. The 4 remaining Titans were floating far above the battlefield, so high that even the large heavy-class meshes looked like tiny specks below them. It was the first time since they had arrived that they were all gathered in a single location. But it was necessary. The Titans were the only thing keeping the psychic virus from assaulting the humans below once more. With the threat of the Monarchs, it was clear that all 4 of them would need to act together if they had a chance of defeating the variant and coming out of it alive. Still, not everyone was happy with the decision. Their soldiers were already being pushed back, with the Titans involved in the fighting. Now that they were removed, things could only get worse. "They will be horrific if another one of us falls. All that matters is we hold until the detonation occurs. We cannot allow the Vor to reach home." Iris Naice spoke up. She was the last member of Augustus' faction here on the sphere, and she had expected to be pushed out or alienated from the group. To her surprise, Patrick Grandister was accommodating to her presence. "We can't cover everything. It will take time for us to travel to a location if a Monarch appears. We should split into 2 groups and hold long enough for the others to arrive. No grand acts of sacrifice to take one of them out. We have no idea how many more are waiting for us in the hive." Patrick suggested. "Agreed. Catherine and I will take the north and east. You both take the south and west." Cal ordered. Can we even win? We all saw the sensor data from the Prometheus. It murdered Yanis in a moment. What is to keep that from happening again? Catherine stated, her voice sounded small and frightened. Wraith was not designed for direct confrontation, and Yanis let his guard down. That won't happen to us. Patrick assured her, I've never seen anything like that before. It was some kind of telekinetic attack concentrated on a single point. Iris added, we've learned from it, though. Stay moving, and don't let your guard down. Cal asserted, and keep your distance. There is no possible way those things can launch attacks like that from miles away. We find the monarchs and bombard them. Iris suggested, Sovereign will shield from the front while Hyperion uses its speed to engage at close range. Caledon, you will keep it in one place while Luminous blasts the thing from Kingdom Come. Patrick explained the plan. Page break. The waiting was the worst part. In Gal's opinion, he watched as people fought and died against the Vor. All the while, he and Catherine were removed from the conflict. Like observers, they hovered in the air and waited. Multiple explosions shook the city below them as the Imperial Guard and House troops fell back to another line of defenses. Nuclear explosions daisy-chained for thousands of miles, splitting off large sections of the sphere and obliterating them. The superheated air wiped the Vor from existence, and it took long minutes for them to be replaced with fresh reinforcements from the hive. How many have the Vor lost since this all began? Cal thought to himself in a mixture of awe and fear. They showed no signs of slowing, and as time marched on, more of the larger and stronger variants were awakening. Already, the multitude of drones was being replaced with soldier variants. But as they grew in number and strength, so did the tactics of the humans evolve to compensate. They were learning the weak points of the Vor or how to position themselves for maximum effect. But the losses on the human side were showing, and Cal estimated they had lost at least 10% of their numbers, possibly even 15. And they still had 5 hours left until they could retreat. Finally, after what felt to be an eternity, Cal saw what they were both expecting and dreading. Another monarch emerged from the void of space. It matched the sensor readings of the Prometheus perfectly. A near twin of the other that had killed Yanis and injured Praxis so terribly. It couldn't be allowed to run amok. It would kill everything in its path to reach the Silver Pyramid, and only the Titans could stop it. Catherine, it's just like we planned. You hamper its movements while I go in for the kill. Don't be a hero. If we can't defeat it, we just need to delay it for the others to arrive. Cal ordered, with a deep, steadying breath. He led the way forward. Page break. Sir, another monarch has been confirmed. Caledon and Havencroft are moving to confront it. Argyle's aide spoke from a communication terminal. Argyle wearily nodded. Have everyone fall back from that sector. It's no place for anyone but a Titan to fight now. Argyle ordered, and it was relayed to the forces holding the line. In minutes, they would be falling back to the following defensive line while Atlas and Hyperion fought a monarch. We're not going to make it. A voice spoke out from behind him, too low for anyone but him to hear. Spinning around, he was surprised to find Alexander mere feet away from him. He hadn't been aware of his presence. Was he losing his edge in his old age that he would let an enemy close enough to stab him in the back? Argyle wasn't used to seeing his brother in a pilot bodysuit, clean, sober and lacking a smile or mocking grin on his face. Instead, the youngest prince looked grim. What are you doing here? I thought I had ordered you to take command of the northern sector. Argyle asked. Alexander merely shrugged at the question. Father asked for my assessment, and I gave it to him. We're not going to make it. It's why I'm here. Argyle, you're not going to like my recommendation, but it's necessary if we are to succeed. Alexander replied, stepping even closer to his brother so that his whisper wouldn't be heard over the din of the command center. Well, I didn't ask for your opinion. Don't think I trust or have forgiven you for what you've done, brother. Argyle hissed. Regardless of your view of me, the fact remains. We have 5 hours left before the artificial sun powering this Dyson sphere detonates. But at the rate we are being pushed back and losing soldiers, we can hold for another hour, possibly 2. You may not trust me, but surely you can also do the math. Alexander explained. Argyle had made the projections. It was a simple equation with a single answer. They were losing, and quickly. The Vor were more numerous than anyone had predicted, and they were evolving by feeding on the dead. At the start of the battle, Argyle had witnessed an exosuited soldier's last rifle pierce a drone's flesh with ease. Now, it was taking multiple direct hits to injure them. And even when they died, 2 more replaced them while the corpses were used as fuel to create more. Argyle shuddered to think what would happen when the monarchs adapted. They could destroy a titan by themselves. What if they multiplied? What was your recommendation to Father? Argyle asked. We need to hurry the process to cut the time down significantly. Alexander began, but Argyle shook his head. Impossible. We've looked at the systems ourselves. Power is being fed back into the artificial sun to destabilize it and create an explosion greater than anything that occurs naturally, but that power has to come from somewhere. It's not as simple as flipping a switch. Alexander, Argyle stated, you're right. We'd need a source equal to that sun above us in order to make a difference. Luckily, Caledon brought exactly what we need. Alexander replied, and Argyle's eyes opened wide at the statement. You want to use Prometheus to fuel the detonation? Argyle whispered, shocked at the audaciousness of the plan. To willingly destroy a Titan? It was unthinkable. The Titan is gone, but its reactor is still intact. Using it as a primer, we can cut the time it takes to detonate the sun in half, possibly even shorter with additional help. Alexander explained. What help? There isn't anything else we could use except for. Argyle wouldn't even give voice to the idea. The starships. Alexander finished the thought for him. You'd destroy our only means of escape? Alexander murmured quietly, carefully to not let another soul overhear them. Such a question would rob the hope of anyone who heard it. Not all of them. I would keep 1 out of every 10 for our exodus. We don't need all of those ships, not by the time this is over. We'll be lucky if half of us make it out of here, and we can abandon the meshes. We can all fit on the few ships I would spare. The rest will be used to fuel the detonation or directly against the Vor. Think of it, Argyle. There are 1,000 bombs floating in the sky above us, just waiting to be used. Alexander hissed. Are we truly so desperate? Argyle muttered to himself, looking at the screen displaying troop movements as they fought against an enemy out of their worst nightmares. Very well, we use whatever means available to us. Chapter 169, War, Part 7. Chapter 169, Strident Blades. Catherine shouted the command word that would activate Hyperion's increased speed. The reactor of the Titan hummed with power, filling the cockpit with the sound of its spinning. She could feel Hyperion's eagerness to strike through the neural link, to prove its superiority against the Vor. The world seemed to freeze around her as her focus reached inhuman levels. Nothing else existed to her but the monarch before her. All extraneous thoughts drained from her mind as she concentrated on what she wanted to accomplish. Even the Vor, with all their evolutionary traits and advantages, couldn't keep up with her speed. She watched as the monarch hovered above the ground, frozen in place while she rushed forward. It seemed defenseless. Its attention was on a group of fleeing meshes in the distance. With a yell, she plunged the howling and incomparably sharp vibrating progressive knife in Hyperion's hand toward the creature's unprotected chest. To her surprise, it felt like it was sinking into a quagmire of thick molasses. The harder she pushed, the more resistance she felt from space around the monarch. Finally, as the blade was mere inches away from the Vor's skin, it halted. She could push closer, nor could she draw her arm back. Worse than that, whatever barrier the creature was using to slow her knife was expanding rapidly. Even to her speed-enhanced senses, she was soon wholly trapped by an energy membrane. The flow of time began to resume its normal pace as the world around her came to life. Cal, I'm trapped. Catherine shouted with fear. She desperately tried to pull Hyperion back from the monarch, but she was unable to move at all. With no response from Cal, terror had her in her grip when the Vor turned its attention toward her. Hyperion was defenseless. Its shields and armor were weak in comparison to the other Titans. It relied on its speed and agility to make up for it. She was helpless if she couldn't move. Easy prey from the monster in front of her. Catherine watched as it languidly raised its hand, extending a single digit in her direction. She had seen the sensor recordings from Prometheus. She knew what would happen next. Whatever powers the monarch had, they would pierce through the cockpit, protecting her like they were made of paper. Cal, please. "Don't let me die." Catherine whimpered quietly. She was sure she had been abandoned, left to her fate. She couldn't blame Cal. The ducal houses could be selfish. Why would he risk his life for hers? Celestial desolation. Cal shouted, his voice breaking through the oppressive silence that surrounded her. Like an angel descending from the heavens, Atlas speared toward the ground like a lightning bolt. Atlas' attack typically affected a wide area, increasing the gravity in the space in front of it to hundreds of times its standard level. But against a monarch, Cal needed something more focused and much more powerful. A monarch could protect itself with a psychic barrier capable of stopping even Prometheus' flames. Cal could only assume that Atlas would be similarly rebuffed in its attempts to use a wide-range gravity attack on it. So, Cal focused all the effects of the attack onto Atlas' own body. He increased the weight of the massive Titan to hundreds of times its average mass and used the Titan itself as the weapon. With its thick armor and enhanced frame, Cal was confident that it could withstand the increased gravity. The Atlas plummeted toward the monarch, and the air funneled behind it as its mass hurtled downwards. Warning notifications lit up Cal's terminal, alerting him to the potential consequences of his actions, but he ignored them. He had faith that Atlas could handle the strain. Locking the Titan's arms around its frame, he tucked its legs up, forming a compact ball that slammed into the monarch's barrier with devastating force. He just needed to puncture it, and the monarch would be helpless against him. In response to his assault, the monarch ignored Hyperion. Keeping her trapped in a quagmire of psychic energy, it spun around, raising its forearms defensively against Atlas as it struck the Vor's barrier. Rather than the expected shockwave of impact, Atlas slowed its descent, sinking into the barrier similarly to Hyperion. Only this time, Cal could see the strain his efforts were having on the monarch to maintain it. With its forearms raised and directed against the Titan, the Vor was slowly being driven toward the ground as it couldn't keep itself alight. "Now!" Cal shouted. Hyperion was still trapped, but Catherine could feel the effects on the Titan loosen as the monarch's efforts were focused on stopping Atlas from crashing into it. The reactor deep within Hyperion thrummed with power, and the knives in her hands resumed their keening wail as she struggled to plunge them deeper. "Just die already!" Catherine shouted angrily. With a final push, she drove the knives into the monarch's chest, piercing its grey flesh. Twisting and turning the blades, she sliced a line through its body. The barrier preventing Cal from attacking weakened, and Atlas crashed downwards, gripping his hands together tightly. Cal slammed Atlas-locked fists against the Vor's head. Like a ripe melon, its skull shattered, sending a spray of black liquid and gore in all directions. Releasing celestial desolation, Atlas settled onto the ground with its normal weight as the monarch crumpled beside it. Even with the Vor's impressive healing powers, there was no coming back for the dead monarch. "We did it!" Catherine shouted with joy. "We did!" Cal replied, smiling at the happy woman on his HUD. In moments, they were interrupted by Patrick's communication. "Caledon, we're nearly there. Hold on for just a little bit more," the young ducal heir urged, pushing the speed of the Sovereign to its limit. Next to him, Luminous was a blur as it flew across the sky. "There's no need to rush, the monarch's dead," Cal replied, taking Patrick by surprise. "You killed it with just the two of you?" Patrick asked in shock. "Are you injured?" Iris asked. "Minor wear on both our Titans. We pushed them pretty hard," Catherine replied. "We'll take over from here, get back to the pyramid and have them repaired." "I get the impression things are going to become chaotic soon." "Argyle has sent out a revised schedule for the detonation. We only need to hold for less than 2 hours," Patrick explained. In seconds, Cal and Catherine could see the two Titans descending from above. Sovereign shone golden in the yellow light, while Luminous was as bright as the sun. "They found a way to quicken the detonation?" Cal asked. He had been a part of the planning for this mission. He knew the limitations they were working with. "See for yourself," Patrick said cryptically, pointing to the sky above them. The yellow sky was gradually darkening. So slow was the change that Cal and Catherine hadn't noticed until Patrick pointed it out. The warm and bright yellow was ripening to orange and less than 10 minutes later, had shifted to an angry red. Patrick explained how the engineers were using the reactor of Prometheus to provide more energy for the detonation, halving the time needed. It was a necessary sacrifice to ensure their survival, but it would mean the irreparable loss of the Titan's reactor. The Dyson sphere began to shake around them as flashes of white light lit the horizon. Cal could see the Vor disappear into the radiance as it scoured the sphere clean of their filth. Once one explosion ended, another would take its place. The second part of the plan. Argyle is detonating the starship engines to buy us time, Patrick said heavily. They watched troops falling back from the front lines as a crashing starship exploded before reaching the surface. Unlike the nuclear explosions they had been using before, the engines left nothing behind to mark its passing. Even the metallic surface of the sphere disappeared. All Titans, fall back to the pyramid. The Vor can sense the end approaching and they're gathering outside the sphere for a final assault. We need you to hold the line for as long as you can. Argyle spoke through their communication channel. The 4 Titans immediately took to the skies, heading toward the pyramid, gleaming in the red light in the distance. Chapter 170 War, Part 8, Chapter 170 10 minutes. Hold for 10 more minutes, and then we retreat, Argyle shouted. Piloting the assault class Mesh Judgment, the Prince was on the front lines fighting the endless Vor. Slicing through a soldier variant with a vibrating sword, Argyle fired his dual, shoulder-mounted PPCs into a line of approaching creatures, cutting through them and clearing a path for his troops to regroup. The conflict had retracted significantly to the point where the humans were clustered just in front of the glowing silver pyramid. Their losses were staggering, and Argyle knew now that Alexander had been correct. They would only need a few starships to flee the sphere with those who remained. Argyle had left coordinating the conflict to his father, who was overseeing the final preparations for the detonation. Above them, the red sun had expanded to hundreds of times its regular size. The artificial star was distorting as it grew, losing its sphere shape and becoming oval. To the troops, they knew the end was coming even without the confirmation from their prince. Soon, they would abandon the pyramid and escape to the starships. Even if the Vor destroyed the pyramid after they had left, it would be too late to stop the detonation. For Cal, the last hour had been a thing of nightmares. They had fought multiple monarchs, and each time the creatures were defeated, they would return stronger and would adapt to their tactics. Cal, Catherine shouted as Atlas slammed into the ground. With the force behind the Monarch's attack, the Titan dug a nearly mile-long trench in the ground. This Monarch was different from the others they had faced. After they had landed a few blows on its body, the creature had destroyed and absorbed thousands of Vor around it. Its body enlarged to 3 times its normal size, gaining additional arms. Worse than its physical abilities, its telekinetic barrier and attacks had reached an entirely new level. It seemed able to predict their movements and respond with frightening quickness. Not hearing a response from Cal, Catherine rushed toward the Vor to distract it while Cal recovered. Patrick, shield Atlas, Catherine ordered as time appeared to slow around her. She saw Sovereign standing in front of the downed Atlas. Its scepter was raised as a golden shield glowed brightly around it. For now, the barrier on Sovereign was still impenetrable, but the Vor were testing the limits of its power. Hyperion rushed around the side of the Monarch, avoiding its eyeline as she looked to test its barrier. She had found through trial and error that the telekinetic ability they used to protect themselves had weaknesses. It surrounded their entire bodies but could be penetrated with enough force if the Vor was distracted or focusing on something else. It was like they had a limited amount of psychic power that they could use to defend our attack, but not both simultaneously. To strengthen their barrier in one location meant weakening it in another. So, Hyperion looked for holes zipping around the battlefield. Her knives slashed at the shields surrounding the Monarch. Catherine would withdraw as soon as she felt the barrier begin to trap her. Once the Titan's movements became sluggish, she would leap away and come at the Vor from a different angle. It was like a dance. Each movement of hers would bring a counter from the Vor. She wasn't sure if its speed was increasing or if it was better able to respond to her actions, but she was no longer untouchable on the battlefield. Slashing again without finding an opening, she stepped away just as a streak of orange energy struck the barrier. Luminous had been clearing the smaller Vor away from where the Titans were fighting, but it seemed she was finally free. The orange lightning bolt hung in the air to the left side of the Monarch, drawing its attention toward the other Titan. Not letting the opportunity pass, Catherine ducked behind the creature quickly. This time, she drove both of her vibrating blades into the monarch's back. It was like trying to stab sand. They merely sunk into the barrier without reaching the vor, but it gave Luminous an opening. Empyrean chastisement. Iris shouted, and the crystal orbs formed a dozen concentric rings between her titan and the monarch. A bolt of orange lightning struck the first ring, buzzing around the orbs quickly before shooting to the next. Each time it jumped, the strength of the bolt grew stronger. The energy changed color, growing lighter as it passed through each ring until it was blindingly white. With a deafening crack, it struck the monarch. So powerful was the energy that it bypassed its telekinetic barrier instantly and burned a hole directly through the creature's chest. There was a shimmer of electricity around the vor before the barrier fell, and it plummeted to the ground at the feet of the two titans. "Good work," Catherine exclaimed. It was the fourth monarch they had defeated, and even though the creatures evolved in response to the conflict around them, the titans were adapting as well. They were working better as a team and becoming more comfortable with their abilities. "Thanks. I'm glad that's the last of them for now." Luminous may be ready to keep fighting, but I need a break. That last attack is too draining. Iris admitted. She was sweaty and exhausted. Directing so many of the crystal orbs was exhausting, and they hadn't had any chance for a break since the fighting started. The Titans were powerful, but their limited number and invaluable presence on the battlefield meant there was no relief. At least the soldiers on the front lines could rotate to the rear. "I'm the same. Hyperion is good for a sprint, but this battle is a marathon. I don't know if I can use strident blades again without a rest. But it's almost over. Another 7 minutes, and we can begin the evacuation." "Patrick, how's Cal doing?" Catherine asked. Sovereign lowered its shields after the monarch had fallen and carefully lifted Atlas from the ground. "He's in rough shape, but he'll live." Patrick replied. "I'm fine." Cal added. His face was covered in blood, and the screen of his helmet was cracked. Despite the gel cushioning, the last blow from the monarch had caused him to strike his head on the cockpit's terminal as he landed. "Stay back. Let us do the heavy lifting for now, Cal. We wouldn't want you to die just when we're at the finish line." Patrick responded, and Cal let out a derisive snort at the comment. "Cal, is a dead vor supposed to do that?" Catherine asked, turning away from the others as she noticed movement from the monarch's corpse. Something was squirming beneath its skin, like worms that were struggling to break free from the flesh that contained them. The limbs and torso of the monarch began to twitch and spasm. "Sensors are showing that it's deceased. What in the world?" Patrick asked. It was bubbling now, like the liquid inside of it boiling. The monarch left a monstrously large corpse, easily over 400 feet in length and so massive that it dwarfed the titans beside it. Black liquid began to leak from its orifices, forming pools on the ground. Catherine and Iris stepped back cautiously, careful not to let the liquid touch their titans. In places, the torso of the monarch bulged suddenly, like a cyst ready to burst. "Retreat, Patrick, form the shield." Cal shouted. He was already moving, dragging the slow-moving Catherine away from the dead monarch. She hadn't been lying when she said she was having trouble with fatigue. The Hyperion felt like it was fighting against her control. She was tired, and the Titan knew it. Her old fears were returning, and her feeling of control when training with Cal was quickly evaporating. Cal, Iris and Catherine had barely maneuvered their Titans behind the expanding shield of Sovereign when the first of the corpse's cysts popped. A spray of black liquid formed a geyser out of the body, sending droplets across the ground and striking the Sovereign's golden shield. To Patrick's shock, he felt the Titan's power begin to ebb. Whatever the droplets were, they were eating away at the shield and were forcing the Titan's reactor to draw on more energy to replace it. Another spray of black liquid erupted from another part of the corpse, and soon it was raining black blood. The ground around them was dyed black, and the metal surface outside of their shield became pitted and eroded from the liquid. "I'm not going to be able to hold it," Patrick shouted as the golden shield began to show signs of failure. Its deep color was quickly lightening in spots, and he knew it was only a matter of seconds before it failed. "Celestial desolation," Cal shouted, driving the power of the Atlas outward. The increased gravity forced many of the droplets to crash to the ground before they reached the shield, but even then, wave after wave of eruptions shot out of the monarch's corpse and it was too much for even Atlas to prevent. The shield failed, and the Titans were exposed to the liquid. Cal watched the armor of Atlas, already damaged from the battle, suffer even more. Like acid, the liquid ate away at the metal, making it weak and brittle. Finally, the black rain ended, the Vor's body was gone, and a lake of black liquid was in its place. Chapter 171 War, Part 9, Chapter 171. It's over. We'll need to be careful from now on and retreat after killing a monarch. Is everyone alright? Cal asked, turning to look at his companions. They were unmoving, simply standing as they were when the shield failed, with arms raised to protect themselves. Catherine, are you alright? Cal asked cautiously. Atlas was still unharmed, although its armor would likely break into pieces at the next blow like the one this monarch had delivered. The Titan's metal surface was pitted and scarred from the black liquid, giving it an aged and decrepit appearance. No! 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 Catherine screamed from the cockpit of Hyperion. The graceful and lithe Titan was heavily pockmarked from the spray of black liquid. Its thin armor hadn't protected it as well as the others, and whatever shielding it possessed collapsed on contact after it was exposed. The Hyperion relied on speed and agility to protect itself, and with the loss of its mobility, it had been nearly helpless against the foreign substance. Catherine, calm down. What is it? Cal asked while rushing to her side. His HUD was filled with the image of the young woman. She was clutching at her helmet, trying desperately to claw it away from her head as she frantically screamed over their communication channel. Yellow eyes, staring at me from the darkness. Catherine hissed, and Cal felt a chill run down his spine. Could the liquid be affecting the neural link? His was fine, but Cal had completely mastered the Atlas. Unlike Catherine, who was still unsure and uneasy piloting the Titan, could their proficiency and comfort with the Titan have some effect on whatever was causing this? It's alright, Catherine. Hyperion is under your control. Disengage the neural link, and I'll bring you back to the pyramid. It will be in the dim cockpit of Atlas. Cal could see something lurking from the corner of his eye, spinning around. Cal ignored everything else, searching for the threat inside Atlas. The green-eyed beast that Cal had learned represented his doubts and fears of the Titan was back. Only this time, it was a foreign presence, an alien intruder. The green eyes were set in a face similar to a monarch. Cal immediately recognized the threat. A foreign entity interfering with his neural link moments after the strange attack by the monarch could only mean a single thing. The Vor were attempting to hijack or destroy his link to Atlas, the black liquid. It's more than just a physical attack. It's a way for them to attack our minds as well? Cal hissed. He wanted to warn the others, but he felt the connection between him and Atlas slip from his control. He had returned to a time when Atlas didn't obey him, and he had to fight it for control. The black liquid was empowering the Titan to slip the bonds of control somehow, whether it was affecting the systems or Cal himself. He didn't know, but it didn't matter. Cal found himself once again in a life-and-death battle against Atlas for supremacy. Outside, Atlas collapsed onto the ground, clawing and scratching at the ground. It was acting like a wild beast. Beside him, the other Titans were behaving even more erratically. Hyperion was crouched at a distance from the others, watching everything around it warily while clawing at its own head. It was mimicking the behavior of its pilot. Sovereign was striking the ground with its scepter, the metal twisting more with each blow. Luminous was the worst. Inside the cockpit, Iris was weeping black tears from her eyes as she laughed with insanity. Luminous had less armor than even Hyperion, and without Atlas to block her as it had done for Catherine, she had been sprayed with more of the black liquid than anyone else. Whatever was infecting the Titan's systems had overwhelmed its pilot in moments, corrupting her with a similar infection as it had done the envoys. Even the vaccine the Emperor had introduced to their genetics was powerless against this new variant. Taking to the air, Luminous shot toward the battle lines, where she began scattering her crystal orbs between the humans and the Vor. In her insanity, she would purge the sphere of all filth. The infection was augmenting the worst of her behaviors. Iris was cold and haughty, looking down on everyone around her, even when she was at her best. The infection was amplifying those traits, causing her to view everyone as vermin and filth. She unleashed the Titan's energies, burning away mobile suits and Vor soldiers before moving on to another cluster. The battle lines, already crumbling for the Vor assault, collapsed wherever Luminous visited. But the Vor were equally disadvantaged, as Iris ignored her personal well-being to deliver destruction upon them. She pushed past her limits, causing harm to both herself and Luminous while doing so. The reactor deep within the Titan began to stutter and fail from Iris' abuse of its systems. Cal was unaware of any of this. He could feel the black liquid creeping through Atlas. It was spreading from the sections of damaged armor and the right arm of the Titan he had used to shield himself and Hyperion. Like a virus, it began to creep its way toward the cockpit. All the while, the assault on his mind continued from its corruptive influence. The Vor had developed a new way to deliver their psychic virus to the immune humans and their Titans by using the black liquid as a carrier. The Vor's adaptability was truly a miraculous and terrible thing. In only a few hours, they had completely changed the delivery system of their psychic virus. And the Titans would be its first victims. No. Cal growled. He had suffered under Atlas before and wouldn't allow it to happen again. While he shunted its assault on his mind away, he focused on the foreign presence invading the Titan's systems. He could only think of one way to remove its influence quickly. Using the little control he maintained on the Titan, he dug into the brittle and broken pieces of armor that were first corrupted. Ripping them off, he hurled an armor segment away. He needed to dig out whatever parts the liquid touched and hope it would stop or slow down the infection rate. Again and again, he tore at the Titan's body. Its clawed fingertips gouged out chunks of pitted metal that carried the taint. With each piece he removed, Cal could feel the burden on his mind ease. Finally, he slashed down with his left hand, severing Atlas' right arm at the elbow. The infection was still there, its presence pushed into the back of his mind. He doubted Atlas would ever fully be cleared of it, but he only needed the Titan to survive a few more minutes for their escape. His mind clear, he rushed toward Hyperion. Its body was much worse. Most of its frame was covered in large pits, and Cal could see severe corruption. The glowing yellow lines of energy that typically ran the length of its structure and limbs were quickly darkening into a sickly brownish color. Catherine's screams were reaching new levels of intensity, and Cal didn't know if there was anything left of the Titan to save. "Stay with me, Catherine," Cal whispered. The young woman was too far gone even to attempt to reason with her or ask her to disconnect from the Titan. He didn't even know if she could. Hyperion may have already had too tight of a hold on her, and unlike Atlas, he doubted anything could be salvaged from it. Cal was left with no choice. He would need to rip her out of Hyperion. Cal plunged Atlas' remaining clawed hand into the back of Hyperion. The fatigued metal collapsed under the Titan's strength, and the area was filled with the screeching sound of tearing metal. Catherine's screams of agony grew louder as if she could feel what was happening to Hyperion. Ruthlessly, Cal seized the hard exterior of the cockpit and pulled it free of the frame. Dangling wires and shards of metal emerged from the cylinder that housed the cockpit. With a sharp yank, he tore them off. Catherine's cries ceased as soon as she was severed from the infected Titan. Hyperion collapsed onto the ground, staining it with black liquid that ran like blood through its connections and wires. "Cal?" Catherine asked weakly. It felt like she was emerging from a nightmare. The horrible visions of death and destruction that Hyperion had shown her were gone, and in its place was the oppressive darkness of the cockpit. With her connection to the Titan broken, she was relying on her bodysuit's comlink to ferry her words to Cal. "I'm here. I got you. You're safe." Cal reassured her, tucking the cockpit under the stub of his severed arm. Cal turned to Sovereign. Chapter 172 War, Part 10. Chapter 172. The neural link amplified the worst or hidden traits for a Titan pilot unless they completely mastered control over it. The system used their bloodline genetics to lessen the burden, making it easier in some ways than a heavy or assault class mesh. But that ease also meant that unprepared pilots often became the inheritors of Titans, and no amount of training or experience could ready them for the link's ability to pull out the extreme defects of their personalities. For Cal, it had been a bloodlust and anger that was buried deep within him even before his imprisonment in stasis. It had built inside him since his grandparents had died, fueled by the ill treatment of his mother and father and furthered by the hardships the Emperor had placed on him. Catherine feared inadequacy and failure, the thought of disappointing her family and duchy. Iris was cold and detached, secretly despising those who were deemed lesser than her. For Patrick Grandester, the faults amplified by the neural link came in the form of increased arrogance and pride. Grandster wasn't the most powerful ducal house, but their lineage could be traced directly to the first emperor, the unifier himself. Sovereign was untouchable. It has never been damaged in battle since it was first created thousands of years ago, until today, when the Vor managed to breach its defenses. The sight of the black liquid destroying the indestructible barrier before splashing across its golden armor sent Patrick's mind reeling. The psychic attack that accompanied it exploited that weakness. Patrick stared at the pitted armor of Sovereign. He was hyperventilating, unable to draw in enough breath to calm his racing heart. He had grown up with stories of the Titan's invincibility, and the burden of piloting it had fallen onto his shoulders. He had never considered the possibility of failure, that he would be found lacking when compared to the other pilots. Patrick was a Grandester. He was better than everyone else. Rage filled him, and the neural link with Sovereign shuddered. His vision was red, and he took his anger out on everything around him. When Cal pulled Catherine free of Hyperion, he found Sovereign standing upright and silent. Its rage had destroyed the ground around it, and it held the mangled remnants of its scepter in its hands. Its once pristine and beautiful armor was pitted and cracked. "Patrick?" Cal asked cautiously. Above them, the red sun was expanding rapidly, and geysers of plasma erupted. There were only minutes left before the detonation. Cal couldn't see any sign of Luminous, but he could hear the crackling thunder of her energy attacks echoing in the distance. "Caledon." Patrick replied calmly. He was isolated and cold. The anger that filled him was replaced with a superiority he had never felt before. Sovereign was the ruler of the universe, and he was its pilot. The black liquid showed him what he must do. "Are you all right?" Cal asked, careful not to approach the unpredictable Titan. "It's so clear to me now. Once I defeat the Vor, House Grandster will take its rightful place as humanity's ruler. Witness my power." "Caledon, you think you are the only one who can master a Titan's abilities?" Patrick stated coldly. He sounded like a stranger to Cal, and he wondered how such a change could occur in Patrick in such a short amount of time. In Cal's HUD, Patrick's face appeared. His helmet was removed, and black tears had made lines down his white cheeks. His skin was pale from the infection, and his eyes were bloodshot and red-rimmed. It was clear to Cal in that instant that he was too far gone for Cal to help him. Cal had seen what was left of the envoys and had sifted through their records. He knew what the infection would do to the Grandster heir. "Patrick." Cal began to respond, but he couldn't find the words to speak. What could he say to a dead man, especially one whose mind was already irreparably damaged? The best Cal could hope for was escaping alive while facing the unpredictable Titan. "Away with you, Baron Caledon. Your weakness is an embarrassment to the nobility. I will handle the Vor alone. Retreat like the coward you are." Patrick mocked, and Cal knew it was the infection speaking. The young man Cal had known could be arrogant but never cruel. "Very well, I wish you the best, Patrick Grandester." Cal said his farewell. With Hyperion's cockpit secured under his arm, Cal took to the skies toward the Silver Pyramid while Sovereign turned toward the massive Vor fighting in the distance. Luminous was still fighting in the center of the battlefield. Orange lightning crackled around her as Iris wiped out thousands of Vor and mobile suits without a tinge of remorse. It was an affront to Patrick's nobility to see Nais fighting the Vor alone, hogging the glory for herself. Grandster would lead, and the other houses would follow, as was proper. "You will regret sullying Sovereign with your taint, monsters," Patrick whispered, and he was suddenly filled with rage once more. The Vor were rubbish compared to him and the Titans. He would prove his superiority on the battlefield. The Titan took to the skies, charging into the dense mass of Vor. It crashed to the ground in their midst, causing cracks to form in the land from the impact. The Vor were pushed back from the brutality of his arrival, but Patrick wasn't done. Final reckoning. Patrick ordered. The golden barrier returned around Sovereign, only thinner and more ephemeral this time. It passed through the Vor for dozens of miles around the Titan and caused unimaginable agony whenever it touched flesh. Vor collapsed, writhing and squirming in pain. Sovereign had dropped its protection in order to level an attack that could cripple an army. Everything around it was its territory, and entry into it would cause creatures to suffer. The bubble of golden light continued to expand, engulfing a large portion of the battlefield. Like Luminous, Sovereign would cleanse the universe of the Vor's taint. Page break. Fall back, God damn it. Fall back, you stupid bastards. Argyle shouted, resorting to curses as he tried to herd his people back toward the pyramid. "My lord, the Titans are killing us." His aide shouted, but there was nothing the prince could do. The time had come to retreat. The sun above them was less than 10 minutes away from having the detonation command fed to it. Even if the Vor took the pyramid now, it was too late for them to stop this. Their destruction was inevitable, but the Titans had chosen the worst time to go insane. The Sovereign and Luminous had barged into the battlefield where the fighting was heaviest and unleashed hell upon both sides. Argyle wasn't sure what had happened. There was a report from Caledon about a monarch exploding, but it was clear that the Titans were lost. It didn't matter. All he had to focus on now was retreating with as many men and women as he could before the sphere detonated and took the hive with it. But the Titans' insanity had meant that things had become a confusing quagmire. Argyle's troops had lost their cohesion, and commands weren't making it to the front lines. The starships were ready, hovering above the pyramid, waiting for them to board. If only he could herd them there. "My lord, Atlas is approaching." The Titan landed beside Argyle's judgment, and Argyle could see the severe damage the Titan had sustained. Missing an arm, its armor was fractured and eroded. Cal gently lowered the cockpit cylinder holding Catherine to the ground. "Why aren't you retreating?" Cal asked as he turned to Argyle. "I'll leave when everyone we can save is on the starships." "Is Havencroft alive?" Argyle asked. He recognized what Cal had been carrying immediately. He knew that Hyperion was likely lost. "She needs medical attention, but she'll survive." "Get her on the ships, Argyle. I'll handle things here," Cal ordered, not caring that he was speaking to the prince in such a manner. He was exhausted and beyond caring about the formalities. "I told you, Caledon, I'm not," Argyle responded, before Cal cut him off. "Anyone who isn't running toward those starships are going to die, Argyle. I'm not pulling my punches. I'll hold the Vor and the other Titans back long enough for you to get everyone on the starships," Cal promised. "And what about you? How are you going to get out of here?" Argyle asked. "I'll jump with Atlas. Just go, Argyle. Leave this to me." Cal responded. He took to the air before Argyle could even reply. Chapter 173 War, Part 11, Chapter 173 The battered and nearly broken Atlas floated above the chaotic battle lines. Human defenders were trying to flee while the Vor threw themselves forward. Through it all, Sovereign and Luminous were causing wanton destruction to everything in sight. Argyle was right. It was a chaotic mess. The red sun was beating down on the surface of the sphere. Its expanded size pushed the boundaries of what the Dyson sphere could withstand. Swollen and distended, it was only minutes away from detonating. A line of silver light was shining upwards from the silver pyramid like a beacon, pulsating in time with the expanding sun's deformation. Cal suspected the Vor knew something destructive was about to happen, which was why they were swarming the battle lines without even collecting the bodies of the fallen. They were ignoring everything to reach their goal of destroying the pyramid. Atlas was sluggish and unresponsive. The damage it sustained was affecting its systems. Combined with the lingering infection, Cal believed this would be the final act of the Titan. To his relief, the reactor within Atlas was fully functional, allowing him to draw on the power he needed. Cal had promised Argyle he would give him the time to let his troops retreat to the shuttles that would ferry them to the waiting starships, and he would fulfill that promise. Celestial desolation. Cal ordered Atlas, speaking the command word for the Titan's unique ability for the final time. Cal felt the pull of the reactor on his neural link as it began to spin rapidly. He focused on the battlefield before him. He needed to block the Vor's advance while allowing the mobile suits and ground troops to retreat. It was a thin line, and he didn't want to impede the retreat. He started carefully, pushing the reactor to form a field of enhanced gravity in a circle out from his location. With cautious precision, he constructed the attack into a wave. The gravitational ripple started weakly, barely increasing the mass of anything around him for miles. The retreating humans barely felt any changes. while on the edges of the battlefield. They gradually became more severe until they reached multiple times the level of normal gravity. 10 times. Cal whispered, the words helping him to concentrate on directing the attack. Once the ripples reached the Vor, they became crashing gravitational waves that pressed down on them at 10 times the standard weight of terror. Comfortable in the knowledge that it was safe, Cal increased the strength of the attack, all while controlling the area of effect 100 times. The waves of gravity that had pressed down on the Vor became a grinding force. In every direction, the Vor were slowed to a crawl as the weight of their own bodies forced them to crawl forward. Even the mighty soldier variants could only sluggishly creep forward, their limbs pushing heavily against the ground of the sphere. Atlas was at the limits of its power. Its reactor spun rapidly, making a thrumming sound throughout the cockpit around Cal. The strain of maintaining the intensified gravitational field at its maximum size and force meant that he could not afford any distractions. Cal was defenseless as he hovered in the sky as the attack reached hundreds of miles in each direction, but the troops below him were finally relieved. They ran in droves for the waiting shuttles that would carry them into the sky and the protection of the jump. Cal merely had to hang on long enough to see them to safety. Page break. Argyle's shuttle settled into the packed storage bay of one of the few remaining starships to survive Alexander's mad plan. Despite his misgivings, he had to admit that his brother was right. Sacrificing the starships to hold off the Vor had worked, and they would be able to squeeze all the survivors into their storage holds. To think humanity had the traitor's Prince Alexander and the son of the traitor Emeric Caledon to thank for their success. Ironically, the Empire owed this great victory to the most unlikely of people. Argyle pushed the errant thoughts away as he walked quickly to the command center. His father and mother were there waiting for them. The Emperor had been overseeing the donation from the pyramid, but had been amongst the first relocated to the starships after no more preparations were to be done. Aurelius looked ancient, his body thin, and his skin had an unhealthy pallor. According to a whispered conversation with his mother, Aurelius had stayed alive as long as he had to see the end of the Vor. Now that the final victory was near, his health was failing. Even the advanced technology of the AI collective couldn't prevent the inevitable. Still, the Emperor observed the red sun for any sudden shifts that could affect the detonation. Nothing would keep him from succeeding. He had worked his entire life to defeat the Vor. He would not fail in the last few minutes. Father, are we still on schedule? Argyle asked, stepping up to the Emperor and reviewing the data displayed on the holo. Amelia was standing next to Alexander, their whispers barely heard over the conversations of the technicians and ship's crew. We are. Less than 5 minutes remain, and the initial projections show that the detonation will be significantly bigger than anticipated. Aurelius replied. Waving his hand in the air, he showed an image of the sphere as it hovered next to the Vor hive. If the projections were correct, the detonation would take out most of the hive, leaving only a few remnants. Good. I'll oversee the evacuation. Inform me of any changes. Argyle replied, walking over to another corner of the command center. The ship rocked slightly around them. The sun's instability was causing problems with all of their systems, but Aurelius assured him they could still jump. Argyle had no choice but to trust in his father. Page break. Caledon, you will not rob me of this glory. Patrick shouted, his voice filled with rage and madness. He had fully succumbed to the infection's madness, and Sovereign itself freely leaked the black liquid from the gaps in its armor. The golden shield that usually surrounded it had turned black and robbed the life of everything within its radius. Vor lay shriveled and dead, drained of their vitality by Sovereign. It was using the life force to fuel its barrier, allowing it to grow beyond its limits. Sovereign was like a black star absorbing the red sun's light until nothing could escape. It could see Atlas in the distance, hovering above the silver pyramid as it used its gravity attack to keep the Vor from the human defenders. But to Patrick, the Titan was a challenge to his supremacy, one that needed to be eliminated. Leaping into the air, its black barrier expanded around it as it flew swiftly toward Atlas. Sovereign left a trail of dying Vor in its wake, inadvertently helping the retreating humans escape. On the opposite side of the battlefield, Iris was coldly crushing another Vor beneath a crystal orb. The colorful spheres had all darkened to black as they were coated in the blood of her enemies. But she didn't care. Iris wrongly assumed the power within Luminous could burn it away, cleansing her of its taint. Like Patrick, Iris was firmly in the grip of the infection. Her beautiful features were twisted with hatred as her eyes wept black tears that left streaks down her cheeks. Even Luminous wasn't spared. The surface of its armor appeared to be coated in tar as if it had waded into the depths of the black liquid. She was just finishing off another group of Vor and a few remaining mobile suits when she felt gravity shift around her like a heavy weight settling onto it. The Titan sank into the soft flesh of the Vor it was standing on. TSK, Caledon, interfering with your betters once again. The Emperor was weak when he let you live. You will die for your sins, as my parents did. Iris muttered. Luminous took to the skies as it raced toward Atlas. Page break. Cal felt the strain of the neural link increase with every moment. Atlas' strength was failing. The accumulation of damage and the ravaging effects of the still lingering infection were making it harder to control. The Titan was at its limits, and so was Cal. He was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. Cal's senses began to beep loudly, drawing his attention to two of his former companions approaching rapidly. He couldn't hold back the Vor and face the two infected Titans at the same time. Atlas was capable of miracles, but even this was beyond its abilities. I'm sorry, Atlas, be free of your burdens. Cal whispered, and he thought he could feel the connection between them strengthen. Celestial Absolution, Chapter 174 War, Part 12, Chapter 174. Atlas controlled the forces of gravity. Just as the mythological Titan of ancient terror carried the burden of lifting the sky on its shoulders, the mobile suit also had a weight hindering its actions. There was a limit to its abilities, one that protected its pilot and, more importantly, the reactor within the Titan. Raising the gravity of an area was a relatively simple matter. Atlas merely stimulated what was already present, increasing its effect on those who entered its sphere of influence. Cal thought of it as enhancing existing forces. Gravity could beget more gravity. But removing gravity was difficult, and reversing its effects in a large area was nearly impossible. Unlike starships whose engines created gravity in space where it did not exist, counteracting natural gravity of the battlefield would tax the reactor too much, rendering it useless. The loss of a reactor would mean the destruction of the Titan. It was an unimaginable loss. The Titans were irreplaceable. Celestial Absolution, Cal ordered, and the limits placed on Atlas were removed. The systems protecting Cal and the Titan's reactor were cast away, leaving him free to do what he needed. The Titan's remaining armor fell from its frame, leaving it bare as lines of green energy flowed from its chest to its remaining limbs. The Titan glowed with subtle light as it raised its hand to the air. The crushing weight holding the Vor in place disappeared instantly across the battlefield. The atmosphere, dragged down by the intense gravity so much that it pulled into the low point of the ground, immediately dissipated upwards in a haze. Cal started slowly by counteracting the Dyson sphere's natural gravity and granting weightlessness to all those within his reach. The atmosphere began to swirl strangely in the now weightless environment. Within the area of the pyramid, where the last of the stragglers were quickly boarding the shuttles, the remaining humans stared at Atlas with awe. Like a shining beacon, it hung above them, protecting them from the Vor. It was stunning to see a single Titan hold back the endless tide of hungry Vor, and many of them swore to honor House Caledon for the rest of their lives. Warning: reactor at 100% capacity. The toneless voice of Atlas's onboard computer spoke through the cockpit's speakers, alerting him to the danger of what Cal was about to attempt. Just counteracting the sphere's gravity had made the reactor reach its limits. Ignoring it, Cal continued, -10 times gravity. Cal whispered. The thrumming reactor stuttered as Cal pushed Atlas to accomplish the impossible. He was aware of the Titan's capabilities and that it should theoretically be possible to use this ability, but Cal had never used it before during his training. The Vor forces, free from the heightened gravity, had started to regain their feet and move forward once again. Their intentions were clear. They were driving themselves toward the pyramid to stop the detonation and eliminate any straggling humans still waiting for the shuttles to carry them to the waiting starships. Their movements were halted once more as gravity reversed. Their bodies lightened instantly and were dragged upwards by Atlas. Many had the instinct to grip the ground for leverage to prevent being carried away, but at 10 times normal gravity, it was too much even for the unnaturally robust VOR to resist. Tens of millions of VOR drones and soldier variants began to rise into the sky, and even the atmosphere that hung for hundreds of miles above the surface was being pushed upwards. To anyone and anything caught in celestial absolution, it felt like they were now falling toward the red sun below them. To Carl, the atmosphere bulged upwards, taking the VOR with it. There would come a point when they would speed past Atlas's altered gravity, but at that distance, they would hang in the weightlessness of the void between the sun and the sphere's surface. Inside the cockpit, more warning lights began to flash, and the stuttering reactor made a whining noise, setting Carl's teeth on edge. He could feel the neural link bucking. The deactivated safeguards were trying to reassert control in order to save the Titan, but Cal tightened his grip on Atlas. Nothing would interfere with him now. Warning, reactor output at 130%. Safeguards disabled. Core temperature outside of safe operating limits. Deactivation procedure activation imminent. The computer spoke once again, and it tried to retake control. Override deactivation. Keep going, Cal stated, shoving away the thoughtless computer from the neural link. Gritting his teeth, Cal concentrated on continuing the attack. Caledon. Patrick shouted over their shared communication channel. Sovereign hovered in the reversed gravity. It seemed to be pushing its thrusters to maximum in an attempt to reach him. The golden light surrounding it was long gone, and the darkness had faded away as there was nothing around it for the Titan to drain to support its shield. An ebony circle hung under its feet, propelling it forward against the rush of atmosphere that Cal was causing to rise. On the opposite side, Luminous was also attempting to reach him. Unlike Sovereign, Luminous was using a bridge of black orbs to form a pathway toward Atlas. It was nimbly running across the rising globes, each step bringing it closer. "How dare you interfere, Caledon?" Iris shouted. Cal disregarded their words. They had been raving over the comm channels for minutes already, practically frothing at the mouth as they butchered VOR and human alike. Cal was more concerned about the fact that celestial absolution was not driving them back. Inconvenienced by the reversed gravity, it was clear they would not be stopped by something of this magnitude. If they reached Atlas, nothing would stop the VOR. Checking his sensors, Cal saw that Argyle's troops needed at least another minute before they could escape. Just another minute. We can grant them that time, Atlas. Cal murmured, and the eyes of Atlas flashed a brilliant green. The wind howled round the lonely figure of the Titan. It stood alone against the tens of millions of VOR. Defenseless as its former comrades approached to destroy it. 20 times reversed gravity. Cal shouted over the keening wail of the failing reactor. The gravity doubled, and the flying VOR ascended even more rapidly. Sovereign and Luminous were taken off guard by the increase, being driven back momentarily. Luminous leapt off its black orbs, spinning through the air as it formed a barrier of energy around itself to halt its movement. It was driving forward once again in moments, although it seemed like it was fighting for every inch. "You won't stop me, Caledon," Patrick howled. Stymied by the rushing wind, he righted himself before drawing on the little power that remained in its tainted reactor. Hand outstretched, Patrick desperately tried to grasp the distant Atlas. Reactor at 170%. Thermal safeguards overridden. The mechanical voice spoke out again before something in the cockpit exploded in a shower of sparks. The terminal in front of Cal cracked as the heat began to rise rapidly. Atlas was failing, and the neural link between them was rapidly deteriorating. It felt like Cal was trying to retain his hold on a greased rope, and an inch would slip out of his fingers each second. Even with all of his willpower and the complete mastery of Atlas, he could do nothing to stop the inevitable. "Come on!" Cal shouted. His sensors, the few that remained operational, saw the last remaining shuttle take to the air. It rose quickly, flipping around in the reversed gravity as it ascended. In seconds, it was gone, and he let out a breath of relief. Cal let celestial absolution fade, and the reversed gravity quickly righted itself once again. Sovereign and Luminous, taken off guard by the sudden shift, were a moment too slow to react. "Open the jump," Cal ordered. The stuttering reactor gave a final power boost, and Atlas channeled it into making a jump portal. The distortion in space hovered a few miles away. But to Atlas, it was out of reach. The overtaxed reactor gave a final, stuttering thrum before falling silent. The neural connection with Atlas ceased, and the cockpit darkened around Cal. So, this is it? So close, only to fail at the last step. I'm sorry, Mayor. I won't be coming home. Cal whispered in the darkness. He could feel the dead Titan falling, rushing toward the ground as it spiraled in the wind. The cockpit jarred suddenly, and Cal was pushed into his seat. Atlas had stopped falling, and a voice intruded into his helmet's communication channel. "You're not dead yet, Caledon." A familiar voice spoke, and Cal was shocked at the identity of its owner. Praxis had seized the Atlas in the arms of his mobile suit, a throne that he had liberated from one of the retreating Imperial Guard below. The AI Collective's medical pods had healed his burnt and battered body, although he was still scarred and barely alive. But it was enough for him to fight still. He had seen the conflict between Cal and the others from the landing pad below, and he refused to allow the son of his enemy to be the one responsible for saving his life. He had grabbed the mesh and took to the air as soon as he saw Atlas falter. "Praxis?" Cal asked. He was stunned that the Earl would risk his life for him. Not responding, Praxis entered the jump portal with Atlas in its arms just as it closed, leaving Sovereign and Luminous to face the Vor alone. Chapter 175 War, Part 13. Chapter 175. The starships emerged from the jump approximately 150 million miles away from the Dyson sphere, far enough away to be protected from the detonation of the artificial sun but close enough to observe its effects in a reasonable time frame. Similar to the distance from Terra to its own star, the Hive and the Dyson sphere were orbs of sparkling light in the darkness of space as 100 starships suddenly appeared in the void. The survivors easily filled its storage holds. They were all that remained of the once mighty fleet, the greatest gathering in the history of the Empire. A little over half of everyone who had left the Empire for this endeavor had lost their life to see it succeed, and no one wanted to wait hours to determine if it would work. In a few minutes' time, their sensors would record the detonation and its effects on the Vor Hive. And over 8 minutes later, they could watch it happen with their own eyes. Argyle stood with his parents and brother on the command deck of the lead starship. His stomach was filled with a mix of nervousness and cautious excitement. They had done everything they could to see this moment, and nothing they've ordered could stop it now. "Sir, we're detecting another jump signature," a crew member reported, and an image appeared on the holo in front of them. The distortion was warped and on the verge of collapsing when 2 mobile suits appeared. Atlas was in critical condition, its systems dead and frame on the verge of collapse, while a throne had its arms wrapped around the Titan. The Earl of Praxis appeared on their screen, his scarred face showing flashes of pain as he labored to operate the mesh. "Bring them on board," Argyle ordered. Landing in the storage hold, Cal used the manual release to open the cockpit. He had to push it open the last bit physically. The lack of power meant the mechanism wasn't fully operational. Climbing down their mesh, he raced toward the throne to assist Praxis. Both of them sported injuries that would kill anyone but a noble. The two of them hobbled together to a viewport to watch the detonation. Page break. Patrick Grandester stared at the collapsed jump portal with hatred and disappointment. Caledon and whoever had been piloting the heavy mesh throne had escaped, but no matter, there were still Vor to be destroyed. His mind felt wrong, and he found that it was hard for him to focus on anything aside from the desire to bring death and destruction to everything around him. If an outsider were to stare inside the cockpit, they would find its pilot unrecognizable as a human. Patrick resembled a shriveled corpse than the handsome young man he had been before the infection flooded Sovereign's systems. The link between them was the only thing keeping him going. Coughing wetly and ignoring the black liquid splattered against his helmet's glass, Patrick was interrupted by the appearance of another Vor monarch. Laughing wildly, he disregarded everything as he shot toward it, intent on taking out his rage on another opponent. Patrick was the irreproachable sovereign, and no Vor could stand against him. He would rule the galaxy as the new emperor from a throne forged from dead Vor. All the while, Patrick felt that he was forgetting something important. He had nearly reached the monarch when the Silver Pyramid, abandoned by humanity only minutes before and overrun by Vor, shot a line of pure silver energy into the sky toward the swollen red sun. Like a needle piercing a balloon, The sun collapsed onto itself. It hung in the center of the Dyson sphere, a tiny pinprick of light before it rapidly expanded. Patrick Grandister and Iris Neis's last sight was of being awash in white light and the relief of being free of the infection. Page break. The artificial sun went supernova, a bursting white light that destroyed everything in its path. The Dyson sphere and hundreds of millions of Vor inhabiting it were vaporized in a flash. The legacy of the AI collective was gone, having finally fulfilled its purpose. Expanding beyond the boundaries of the sphere, the white light crossed the distance to the Vor hive in an instant, destroying all of the creatures still in the process of traversing the void to assault the now departed humans. The surface of the hive smoked and cracked as the detonation swept across its exterior. The hard carapace that had been formed over tens of thousands of years couldn't resist the terrible destruction. Like water evaporating under intense heat, the ground melted away. Deeper beneath the surface, the tunnels filled with Vor creatures burned from the radiation and superheated plasma. A trio of monarchs on their way to support the attack on the sphere, attempted to halt the destruction with their psychic powers, forming a bubble around themselves. It lasted for only a split second before they were overcome. The sphere's detonation scoured the surface away from the hive, digging deeper into the core of the Vor's living colony, millions of miles below. At the center of the structure, something stirred awake in response to the unprecedented danger the Vor were facing. Page break. Argyle could hear the cheers throughout the starship as the detonating artificial sun blew away the sphere and the Vor hive. Disappearing in the harsh white light, the expanding wave of destruction would stop well before it reached their fleet. Sensors on board read the increased cosmic radiation, and from their calculations, there was no possible way that anything could survive within the supernova. "It's over, it's done," Aurelius whispered, and his legs gave out. The Emperor of Humanity collapsed onto the ground and wept tears of joy and relief. The burden he had been living with since his father had taken him to meet the envoys millennia ago was finally gone. He could rest at last. "Father, Aurelius." "Medic, someone fetch the doctor," Argyle ordered, and the crew began to scramble. The euphoria over the Vor's defeat was immediately replaced with concern as Aurelius was carried away to one of the private quarters on board while Amelia attended him. Page break. Cal leaned back against the ship's hull, bone-tired and finished. Atlas was collapsed on the storage hold floor, its systems dead as its reactor was destroyed. The cost of victory had been immense. Tens of thousands of deceased, along with 1,000 starships and 6 Titans. The Titans were the only thing keeping the borders of the ducal houses intact, and Gal let out a sigh at the thought that the next few years could consist of endless wars and conflicts. Havencroft may have the forces necessary to stave off defeat, but Caledon would be at the mercy of its neighbors. Cal rested his head against the cold hull of the ship. He had sacrificed so much for his homeland and the Empire. Without Atlas, it may no longer matter. "You're awfully depressed for someone who snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, Caledon," Praxis said. He winced as he lowered himself to the ground. His scarred and injured body was horrific to see, and Cal was impressed that the man was still alive. He would need years of rejuvenation to recover from his wounds. "I'm just picturing what's waiting for us back in the Empire," Cal responded tiredly. "A hero's welcome and a comfortable bed?" Praxis retorted before shaking his head. "I know exactly what you're worried about. No Atlas or Prometheus. Hyperion, Luminous, Sovereign and Wraith. Irreplaceable Titans. While the others still survive, at least you have our Ouroboros to defend your borders," Praxis retorted. "For now, until Augustus or some other prince demands its return at the head of an Imperial Guard army, things need to change." "Praxis," Cal whispered. Usually, the Earl of Praxis would fly into a rage at the notion of disobedience to the Emperor. Sacrifice and loyalty to the Empire was paramount for a noble. But now, after everything he had experienced and the loss of their guardian Titan, Praxis shared the same sentiment. He was about to reply when Amelia approached them from the front of the storage hold. She looked tired and pale, and Cal was struck by just how old she seemed at that moment. "Caelan, he wishes to speak with you, to make amends before the end." Chapter 176. Battle's Aftermath. Chapter 176. "Caelan, Come closer. I'm glad we've had this chance to speak before the end. I've always enjoyed our discussions. It saddens me that we didn't have more opportunities to converse. Aurelius' voice was quiet and dry, broken by slight coughing fits that left him out of breath. The emperor was dying, and it was clear to anyone who saw him. Whatever mental perseverance and drive that sustained him over the millennia was finally gone. His body was failing him, and even the advanced technology of the AI collective could do nothing to halt it. There were limits to longevity that could not be overcome, and Aurelius had reached them. Cal felt a mixture of emotions. Despite everything that had happened, he still respected Aurelius. He understood him. The things he had done were explainable, but they were also unforgivable. His imprisonment, the attack on Terra, and the preparations necessary to confront the war. There was sense to it, but it was a cold and heartless logic. I'm sorry. I know that I should be saddened, that I should mourn your passing, but this isn't the first time you've died, Cal replied as he sat in the chair placed beside the Emperor's bed. Crisp white sheets matched the stark room of the medical chamber. Aurelius laughed softly at the words. No, I suppose it isn't. I apologize for the deception, Caledon. It was necessary to prepare the Empire to fight the war. Now that our fated enemy is defeated, we have the luxury of regret. One enemy is defeated, and another looms. Just because the war are gone, it doesn't mean there will be peace throughout the Empire. 6 Titans are destroyed, and the remaining houses will use their absence to seize more of our territories. I can't help but blame you for it. A continuation of your succession war, Cal replied quietly. A human failing given an entire galaxy, and we still want more. I believe you are correct, Caledon. As things stand now, peace will be as elusive as always. The Empire was created to enforce the taboo and unite humanity in order to better oversee it. I wonder how humans will act when they learn the AI collective is gone, Aurelius muttered. I don't know. To those with the knowledge of their involvement, they were always a boogeyman waiting in the dark for us to slip up. The taboo has no meaning now. We are free to develop new ways to kill each other, Cal stated. As we have always done without enforced order, the Empire will endure as long as people like you inhabit it, which is why I wanted to see you before I pass. There's something I want you to have. Aurelius slowly lifted his withered hand, pointing it at the table beside them. What is it? Cal asked, picking up the datapad. The AI collective left extensive records behind. Even after the virus corrupted their systems, backups remained. I spent centuries cataloging it. On that datapad is everything I have learned from my research. Of interest to you is the specifications for creating new Titans. You're entrusting this to me? Cal asked with shock. Whatever you feel about the Empire, a fact remains. The galaxy needs the ducal houses to maintain order. Without the Titans, things will descend into anarchy. But I leave the choice to you. Use what I have given you for your own gain, or share it freely with others. Aurelius paused, looking at the young man next to him. I'm sure the Emperor and the other ducal houses will agree to nearly anything for what you possess. Restore the balance of power in the galaxy, hold elections in every sector and bring back democracy. Whatever your heart yearns for. I leave the Empire's future in your hands, the Emperor said, leaning back in his bed and falling asleep. Cal watched him carefully for a moment, tapping his finger thoughtfully against the datapad. Goodbye, Aurelius, Cal whispered before standing and leaving the room. Page break. The funeral for the Emperor was held on board the lead starship at the site of humanity's greatest victory. A casket was released into the void with the detonation of the artificial star still glowing in the darkness. Argyle said only a few words, speaking only briefly of the great deeds of his father and their complicated relationship. There were mixed feelings for everyone attending. Like Gal, they could recognize why he had done what he had, but the truth was that the Emperor had allowed Terra to come to harm, an unforgivable sin in the eyes of those gathered. He had also led them into a nearly hopeless battle against an unknown enemy before giving them the tools for their success. It felt like the end of an era, and a necessary one if they were to look to the future and repair the damage the succession war had caused. Empress Amelia watched silently as her husband's casket drifted out of the starship's hold. To anyone watching her, she seemed emotionless, her thoughts unknowable, but Cal could recognize the sadness and grief. But as he had with Aurelius, he couldn't bring himself to comfort her, To Carl, she was as guilty as her husband, and the sting of her betrayal was still too fresh. Perhaps there could be forgiveness in time, but for now, Cal could not find a way to bridge the gap between them. Page break. "Sir, we are detecting something on our sensors," one of the crew members reported, bringing it to the attention of Argyle. The prince summoned his brother to the command center to provide advice. Despite his loathing of the latter, Argyle knew that Alexander had as keen a mind as their father. Combined with the research he had done on board the Dyson Sphere, it made him one of the only subject matter experts regarding the war on board. "What is it?" Argyle asked, leaning into the terminal to try and make sense of what he was seeing. There appeared to be a dark smudge in the superheated plasma of the ongoing detonation. Could it be a false reading? Some kind of interference with our sensors? Alexander added, tapping on the terminal to try and clear up the readings. "Those are the coordinates where the hive was last reported." One of the Imperial Guard commanders replied. She had been at the forefront of the fighting and had watched the detonation with her own eyes. No one more than the Guard wanted the Vor to be dead, but they were always prepared for the worst. "Give me a moment. I'm going to try to do something from the A.I Collective's research. I don't know how much of a boost it will give us, but by relaying it through," Alexander muttered. Images and readouts flashed across the hollow almost too quickly for Argyle to pick sense of. "Got it." Alexander finished. The image, a dark smudge before, grew in clarity until everyone could see it for what it was. A dark sphere, made of some kind of ultra-dense material, still remained at the near center of the detonation site. Even with the intense radiation and superheated plasma, it resisted any damage to its surface. Argyle estimated it to be the same size as a starship, a tiny speck compared to the size of the hive, but anything that could survive that detonation was cause for concern. "Is it Vor?" Argyle asked. It seemed to simply be hovering in space, allowing the currents of the exploding star to wash over it. "Unknown. Our scans can't penetrate the surface." "But what else would it be?" "A mysterious sphere of nigh-indestructible material appearing where the hive was. It's safe to assume that it's Vor." Alexander answered, "I want a plan to destroy it." "I don't care what we need to do." Argyle was interrupted by Alexander. "It's moving." Alexander whispered. Did it sense their scans somehow? The black sphere rapidly sped away from their ship, breaching the limits of the detonation in seconds, trailing bright plasma behind it. The object entered something akin to a jump portal in moments. "It's gone," the guard commander shouted. "Track it, now," Argyle ordered, and Alexander once again flew into action. His fingers danced through the air as he manipulated the hollows. Their computers quickly calculated a trajectory based on its heading when it entered that portal. It's likely heading to Andromeda. If their method of travel is anything like the AI Collective's, they will reach it in a few centuries. Alexander concluded. Then the threat continues. We've merely had a stay of execution. If there is any life in Andromeda, they'll consume it and rebuild to strike at us once again. Argyle replied grimly. Chapter 177, Epilogue, Part 1. Chapter 177, Epilogue, Part 1. A young woman walked through the halls of the newly rebuilt Imperial Palace on Terra. Unlike the old Palace of Versailles, this building was sleek and modern. It was also filled to the brim with visitors and traveling dignitaries. Things had changed for Terra over the past 2 decades of rebuilding. Her father told her stories of how very few people would be allowed to visit humanity's home world. Sacred Terra was only for the nobility, and even they could not live there without the Emperor's permission. Those days were gone now. Terra was open to everyone if they wanted to visit using a tourist visa. Longer stays or permanent residency required significant accumulated merits for Imperial service to obtain. Serving in the Imperial Guard, Humanitarian Corps, or even the Imperial bureaucracy for a number of years were all avenues of service. But for a noble like Flo, she could visit whenever she wanted as long as her parents didn't interfere. They seemed to be clutching onto her tighter every day, and she couldn't wait until she was able to travel freely. As an accomplished mesh pilot, she was more than capable of looking after herself. She just wanted an opportunity to prove herself without having to rely on her parents. Today was a momentous occasion on Terra, hence the reason there were so many people gathered. There seemed to be 2 reporters for every bureaucrat or noble in attendance. Pushing her way through the throng, Flo reached the large chambers that served as both the emperor's throne room and the location of today's trial. It would be the first time a noble was tried under the new constitution, something that her parents had worked hard to implement. Flo almost couldn't believe that nobles could act as they pleased, without consequence or oversight aside from what the emperor could see or hear. It was unbelievable to her. The new Civilian Oversight Committee had worked overtime developing the template, with solid support from amongst the ducal houses. And today was the evidence that it was working. The noble on trial currently was a real piece of work, as her mentor would say. Coming into the large room, she took her place just a few rows down from the imperial throne. The emperor hadn't arrived yet, but members of all the ducal houses had. She had barely straightened her clothing when her father's regent leaned over to speak to her. "You're late." Samuel chided her. When he spoke to Flo, the typically stern older man looked anything but his usual self. He considered himself something of an uncle to the young woman, taking her under his wing to teach her everything he knew alongside his own children. "Am I? Uncle Augustus isn't here yet. How can I be late if the emperor hasn't arrived yet?" Flo replied. Samuel raised his hand and flicked her lightly on the forehead. She refrained from rubbing the spot. Instead, she glared playfully at Samuel. "Silly girl, did I teach you nothing? How would it look if Florine Caledon came sprinting in after the emperor already arrived, panting and sweaty?" "After all, we're gathered here because of your efforts," Samuel responded. "I wouldn't be panting and sweaty. I'm always dignified and ladylike," Flo returned, and this time, a smile cracked Samuel's iron expression. "Indeed, you are incredibly ladylike." "Is that why I received a report that you and your cousin were, how did it read, slandering and maligning the great house of Carmichael? Did you really tell Malik Carmichael that the birthing pods must have malfunctioned when he was conceived?" Samuel asked, slightly impressed at the young woman's daring. "Of course, I could think of no other explanation as to why he looks and acts like a troll. Malik is lucky I have such a great sense of self-control." Catherine wanted to punch the odious turd in the face. Flo replied, "Thank heavens one of you control yourselves." Samuel replied dryly. They were interrupted by the arrival of the emperor. Augustus had sat on the throne for 20 years since the ending of the Succession War and the campaign against the Vor. In that time, peace had returned to the empire, and a sweeping reform to its once oppressive policies. Many agreed that the empire was experiencing a period of growth. The economy was booming, with new technologies and inventions being introduced rapidly thanks to the collection of research retrieved from the AI Collective. Even the borders of the empire, once stagnant, were expanding. To counter this new focus on advancement, Augustus had developed an AI watchdog group to oversee technology development and ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. Some mistakes were made along the way, but many agreed that if artificial intelligence were reintroduced to society, it would be treated quite differently than it had been in the past. Standing at attention, the room was quiet as Augustus sat on his throne. Wearing a formal suit with gold highlights and the imperial eagle on the breast, he surveyed the room before gesturing to an aide. "Thank you all for attending today. This marks a new beginning for our empire. Demonstrable proof of our constitutional monarch in action. I have pledged the equality of all under the law, and I stand by that commitment. Today, you witness history, the first trial of a noble since the rebellion, over 500 years ago. Bring in the prisoner." Augustus finished, nodding to a member of the Imperial Guard who left the room. Through a side door, a man strode proudly into the chamber, flanked by a pair of Imperial Guards in exosuits. He looked as if an honor guard was escorting him. Jonathan, once known by the criminal moniker Lying Jack and now known as the Baron of Planet Granville, walked through the gathered throng with his head held high. After receiving an amnesty and title from Prince Argyle, Augustus had honored their deal. Granted the planet of Granville in what had once been Caledonian space. He had lived well as the ruler there, along with his former consors. As Caledon expanded his borders and seized what had once been under their ducal house, Jack had managed to remain independent through his connections with the royal family and several of the other ducal houses. Until the passing of the imperial constitution, codifying the laws all nobility had to adhere to. Needless to say, Jack didn't last very long under its strict rule. Baron Granville. Augustus spoke as soon as the guard halted Jack at the base of the throne. Rather than bow or kneel as was proper for a noble when greeting the emperor, Jack smiled widely as he held his arms out to the sides. "Cousin, how good to see you once again. It's wonderful for you to throw this little celebration for me. You needn't have gone to all the trouble. I understand that I was wrong. How about a slap on the wrist, and I'll be a good boy from now on?" Jack exclaimed, and the crowd muttered at the display. With a sigh at Jack's complete lack of decorum, Augustus turned toward Samuel and Flo. "Granville lies in the Caledonian sector. Let his accusers stand forward." Augustus gestured. Samuel stepped into the spotlight, standing across from the throne on the right side of Jack, while Flo stood half a step behind the regent. "Why have you brought this noble before us today?" Augustus asked formally, beginning the process. "My emperor, as per the law, Caledon accuses Jonathan Granville of the following offences: theft, embezzlement, unlawful confinement of imperial citizens." Samuel began to read out the charges against Jack, and with each one, the muttering of the crowd grew louder. It seemed like Jack was being accused of the very worst behavior of a noble, but one that wouldn't have warranted a formal trial by the emperor even a few decades ago. The public could see just how effective the new constitution was by the trial being broadcast across the galaxy. "Florian Caledon, you represent the ducal house of Caledon in this matter? You are the one to bring a noble under the jurisdiction of your house to trial?" Augustus asked, although he already knew the answer. The young woman had led a force of Meshs against Jack's Corsairs with minimal losses. After subduing all of Jack's military forces on the planet, she had brought them directly to Terra by her father's order, the Duke of Caledon. "I did, my emperor," Flo replied, nearly faltering at her words as all the eyes gathered upon her. "And you did so with no casualties on either side and only a few damaged Meshs?" Augustus continued, and Flo took a deep breath. They had coordinated this beforehand. A revelation for the public. "I did, using the Titan Pleiades," she stated, and the crowd erupted at the statement. Chapter 178, Epilogue, Part 2. Chapter 178, Epilogue, Part 2. Piloting a Titan at the age of 19, an impressive accomplishment. The Empire owes you a debt of gratitude, Florian Caledon, for bringing this criminal to justice. We have reviewed the evidence and are prepared to render a verdict," Augustus announced, and one of the imperial servants stepped forward. Clutching a long staff topped by a statue of a golden eagle, he used the iron bottom to strike the ground with a loud, ringing sound. The murmurs from the crowd ceased immediately. "Jonathan, Baron of Granville, you are hereby stripped of all titles and assets. Granville will be given to House Caledon for oversight until Duke Caledon can assign the fief to another. You and your Corsairs will be conferred to Prince Argyle for punishment," Augustus ordered. "You. What?" Jack was stunned. He expected that they would seize his titles and that he could possibly serve time in stasis for what he had done. But what did it mean to be given to the Emperor's brother? Argyle had largely been out of the public eye for decades since returning from the operation against the Vor. "Argyle, step forward. It is time for the announcement," Augustus said, turning to a shadowed alcove behind his throne. Prince Argyle strode forward. Wearing an Imperial Guard exosuit, he looked younger and healthier than he had during the fighting against the Vor. Rejuvenation procedures, harsh training and preparation for this day had worked wonders for his health. Not to mention being free of the stress of rulership, he preferred a simple and straightforward goal over politics. Standing next to the Emperor, Argyle was a paragon of martial prowess. He exuded competence, and it was easy for Flo to see why the Imperial Guard admired him. Augustus stood from his throne. Looking around at the assembled crowd, he made a long-anticipated proclamation. "As all of you are aware, the Vor escaped our grasp when we fought them aboard the AI Collective's Dyson Sphere. They are currently racing toward the Andromeda Galaxy, and no starship or means of transport we possessed at the time could match them," Augustus said gravely. "But that time has changed. Using the knowledge collected from the Dyson Sphere, The Empire has constructed the greatest fleet in the history of mankind. 100,000 starships, all capable of a new form of jump that can bridge the divide between galaxies. And at the center, a Dyson sphere fashioned from the technology that allowed us to strike a crippling blow to our enemies. Argyle, my brother and the man who led the first campaign against the Vor, will once again be called upon to defend humanity. Augustus finished. Gripping his brother's shoulder firmly, he whispered something before sitting back on the throne. This campaign will lead us to a new galaxy against a foe which many of you cannot conceive of their violence and fury. Tens of millions of troops from every corner of the Empire will be giving up everything they have known on our journey. Selected from amongst the very best of humanity, it is on them that we will pin all of our hopes. Furthermore, this will not just be a war. We will be forging a new beachhead for humanity's expansion. New colonies will be created, and additional noble houses formed. We will be exploring a new galaxy, one of which we know nothing about. I ask those with the courage and fortitude to enter the unknown, to face the Vor and put an end to their threat to join me. Argyle shouted, and the crowd erupted at the words. Augustus waited for a lull to speak once more. Jack, you and your Corsairs will be joining Argyle on his crusade against the Vor. You owe a debt to the Empire, and your service with the Andromeda fleet will see it paid. Augustus added, looking at the Corsair as he stood stunned at the revelation. Flo could hardly believe what they were saying. A fleet journeying to an entirely new galaxy to face an evil that could threaten the Milky Way. And they would be settling on new planets, creating new noble houses. The things she could see and experience there were mind-boggling. Stepping forward, she knelt in front of the Imperial throne. My Lord Emperor, I seek a boon. I wish to join the fleet, along with my Titan. Page break. Absolutely not. I won't have my granddaughter traipsing across the void to another galaxy, especially not with the Vor, and who knows what else is waiting for them. I don't know what Augustus said to convince Argyle to take on this mad endeavor, but you are not going. Amara said crossly. They were in the princess's quarters in the Imperial Palace. She officially resided on Havencroft, but maintained rooms on Terra in case she or her family wished to visit. From behind them, Amelia sat on a couch with her legs crossed, frail and ancient. The former empress was feeling the effects of her age. She had removed herself from the public eye, preferring to divide her time between Havencroft and Caledon. Flo was currently staying with her grandmother while on Terra, and Amelia couldn't help but compare the young woman to her parents. Flo was as stubborn as Mela while retaining the steadiness and perseverance of Caledon. It made her unstoppable when she put her mind to something. However, Flo had an itch for exploration and adventure. Unlike her twin brother, Emeritus was more than happy to stay on Caledon, absorbed in his studies or other pursuits. You can't stop me, grandmother. The Emperor has already agreed to my request. What would it say about House Caledon if I am removed from the fleet? Who would be willing to send their sons and daughters to Andromeda if I back out now? Besides, this is what I've been dreaming about my entire life, a real adventure, like what Mom and Dad experienced. Flo exclaimed, throwing up her hands and going to her great-grandmother. Flopping down onto the couch, she crossed her arms grumpily. Those adventures nearly killed them. Your father fought the Vor, along with 5 other Titans. You know how that turned out. He barely returned and now owes a life debt to Praxis of all people. Amara replied, I know all that. Cousin Catherine explained the risks to me. How father brought her home and even helped Havencroft recreate Hyperion. Catherine has already announced her intentions to join the Andromeda expedition. Flo responded. Wait until Mason hears of that. I doubt she will be setting foot anywhere near that fleet. Amara stated. I would be surprised. This is important for everyone, Amara. It's not just a matter of finally destroying the remaining Vor, but also for humanity to set foot in another galaxy. This is everything that Aurelius worked toward. Amelia added, there are going to be hundreds of Titans on board, and it's not like we are going to get there in a day. Uncle Argyle said it would take years for us to reach Andromeda. We'll be living and training on the Dyson sphere during the trip. We might even make it there faster than the Vor. Flo explained, the advanced technologies of the AI collective, combined with their own, had led to inconceivable advances. Unless their estimates were incorrect, they could reach Andromeda in a decade, maybe less, while the Vor would still be making the crossing. By the time the Vor arrived, humanity would have fortified and prepared. It doesn't matter, you won't convince me otherwise. And when your mother finds out, there is no way in this galaxy or another that she's going to let you leave, accompanied by a Titan or not. Amara finished. Father will. He understands the importance of service to the Empire and that we must all do our duty. Flo retorted. And what of your duty to Caledon? Father, Mother and Emeritus can look after Caledon. Besides, Mother and Father are only in their early 40s. Most of the nobles I studied with on Terra were twice their age. I can go all the way to Andromeda and return, and they will still be younger than any other duke or duchess. Flo explained. Her logic was sound. Caelan and Mela Caledon were young compared to the other ducal houses. The only house with a younger leader was Nais, and that was due to the loss of their duchess to the war. It was true that Caledon was also experiencing an unprecedented period of peace and expansion. They were soon going to take their place amongst the strongest of the ducal houses, both militarily and economically. A large amount of their meshs, developed by Ezra, were going to Andromeda as well. Fine. I look forward to hearing your arguments to your father. He's the only one that could possibly allow this to happen. Amara added doubtfully. She knew how protective Caelan Caledon was of his family. Chapter 179, Epilogue, Part 3, Chapter 179, Epilogue, Part 3. Cal turned off the hollow display of Lying Jack's trial with a sense of dismay. At the end, the recording had caught his daughter's request, broadcasting her desire to join the expedition to Andromeda. It would forever be immortalized in history, the first noble scion of a ducal house to willingly step forward and volunteer to settle a new galaxy and fight against the Vor. Cal would look to have not aged a day to an outsider since he had faced the Vor himself. Now in his mid-40s, his superior genetics and medical technology had all but ceased the aging process. He was in his prime but had no desire to fight the Vor again. He had barely survived his first encounter with the strange aliens. He had nearly lost Atlas and his life and that of Mare's cousin, Catherine. If it hadn't been for the assistance of Praxis, he wouldn't have returned home. But how could he explain to his daughter what she would be facing in Andromeda? The young woman wanted adventure and to be free of her parents' control. Cal couldn't blame her. Every young person wants to forge their own path. The harder he tried to stop her, the more he would drive her away. She's not going. Mare spoke up from where she sat in front of the display. She had been quiet for too long, a worrying sign if there ever was one. Cal let out a sigh, running his fingers through his hair. You know that we can't forbid her from going. She's a grown woman, capable of making her own decisions. If we tried to interfere, the entire galaxy would learn of it. Flo has already committed to the fleet, and we can do nothing about that. Cal replied. I'll speak with Uncle Argyle. He can deny her. He'll even assume all the blame if it comes down to it. Mare countered, and Cal scoffed at the notion. Do that, and she'll hate you forever. Cal explained. At least she'll be alive. 6 Titans faced those monsters, and none of them returned. Mare shouted, standing from the couch and pacing the room. I'm aware of that. Cal replied dryly. But this time will be different. With the information Aurelius gave to me, we can now build more Titans than ever. The fleet will be 10 times as strong as their one we had before, with dozens of Titans and a new Dyson sphere. Our technology is better, and we understand the Vor. Cal retorted. She's not ready for this, Cal. She and Catherine are going to be on their own. I can't believe that Mason agreed to allow his daughter to go. What was he thinking? The same thing as us. We have no choice. It's not our decision what they do. Pleiades and Hyperion were given to them to do with as they saw fit. Cal stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his wife. They'll be all alone. Mare whispered, and he could see tears in her eyes. Perhaps not. Cal said cryptically, and Mare turned to look at him. How would it look if her parents followed her? She would say we didn't trust her abilities and were overbearing. Duke and Duchess Caledon cannot go to Andromeda. Mare explained. No, they can't, but Merritt of Caledon could, along with his wife, Ella. Cal said with a smile. Mare's eyes widened at the suggestion. Leave Caledon for Andromeda and the inevitable conflict there to see an entirely new galaxy and possibly create a new life there? What about Emeritus? Mare whispered. He's to begin his schooling on Terra soon, and we would be back in a few decades. With Samuel watching over Caledon, we'll barely be missed here. I'm sure Tamara could support as well. She would know it was us. Atlas and Ouroboros stand out. Everyone knows who their pilots are. Mare said with doubt. She was keen on the idea of traveling to Andromeda, but she didn't want Flo to feel stifled by their presence. They just wanted to keep an eye on her. Atlas and Ouroboros will need to stay in Caledon. With the improvements to its systems and its onboard computer, Samuel can use Atlas to defend the sector if needed, and Ouroboros can go to Emeritus when he's ready. They're too distinctive for Merritt and Ella to use. But I have a surprise, Cal said with a grin. Taking his wife by the hand, he led her through the halls of the Caledonian ducal estate. Taking an elevator, they arrived at the deepest level of the structure where Atlas had once been stored by his grandparents. Coming to the vault, Cal pressed his hand against the metallic doors. The cold metal lit up, forming an array that scanned him before the doors silently opened. When I found out about Argyle's intention to build a fleet to pursue the Vor shortly after we returned from the Dyson Sphere, I had Ezra commission new meshes. It was the only way I could be sure that the technology that Aurelius left us would be put to good use. After rebuilding the Lost Titans and creating additional ones for our allies, Elric designed something else. Cal explained. They entered the large vault, where Atlas and Ouroboros stood waiting along the large, bare walls. The ceiling could retract, allowing the Titans to leave if called upon. Ignoring them, aside from a fond look at the rebuilt mobile suit, Cal led Mare through another series of doors to a new location. The Titans are too iconic and would draw too much attention. But I am loath to travel to Andromeda without the power to protect our family. I think these will allow us to fight while maintaining a low profile. Cal opened the last door, revealing the contents to his wife. A pair of mobile suits were positioned inside at the very center of a newly constructed vault. Painted black and red in the Caledonian colors, the Ezra designs were visibly in their structure. The one on the left was winged and humanoid, with a long spear grasped in its hands. This one was clearly female, unlike many mobile suits that leaned toward a masculine frame. Its armor was light and graceful, while Mare could see the individual feathers that made up its wings. Valkyrie. It's classified as an assault class, but its reactor and capabilities are on par with Atlas or Ouroboros. It's frighteningly agile, and the feather segments of its wings are detachable, each capable of piercing 10 meters of steel. Cal explained before pointing at the next. This one was noble and elegant. Humanoid as well, it was festooned with weapons. Lasguns were attached to its waist, while it wielded 2 PPCs in its hands and had twin cannons on its shoulders. It can output more energy than even Atlas while maintaining its shields. We will be sending 500 of each of these meshes to Andromeda, along with the pilots assigned to them, but these 2 will belong to Merritt and Ella. Cal clarified, the Vor aren't going to stand a chance. And with these, we will keep Flo and everyone else safe. Mare replied, gazing up at Valkyrie. Page break. The Dyson Sphere humanity built was nearly a carbon copy of the AI collectives, designed using plans obtained from the destroyed structure. It was no surprise that the Empire made minimal changes during its construction. A vast city, curving upwards as it stretched into the distance, spread out in front of Merritt and Ella as they descended the shuttle. Landing in an open plaza, they were greeted by a throng of people. The sphere was to be inhabited originally by the soldiers and specialties required to fight the Vor. Tens of millions of troops would be carried across the galactic void between the Milky Way and Andromeda in the sphere. That number had skyrocketed once the houses and the Imperial civilians had learned that they would also be settling new worlds. Each house sent millions of settlers and their own house guard to protect them. Civilian businesses and corporations, seeking new worlds to inhabit, also sent their employees. Along with the families of the troops and settlers, the sphere now held tens of billions of people. The sphere could easily accommodate the numbers, and the city was packed to the brim when the cutoff was finally reached. Every building and accommodation was filled, along with the warehouses and storage areas. Following the sphere would be the fleet, 100,000 starships that would allow war to be waged against the Vor and aid in the settlement efforts. Merritt and Ella made their way to the Caledonian section of the city. As one of the great ducal houses, Cal had allowed any of his citizens to make the journey and provided millions of troops to protect them. Buildings and streets were colored black and red in the Caledonian livery to indicate their allegiance. Talha's son, the guard commander of House Caledon, and Merrickdan were leading them, two of the only people on board to know Merritt and Ella's true identities. Talha had brought her husband, Micah, as well as her son. She was indifferent to the journey, but Micah was the driving force behind their decision to join. In contrast, Merrickdan hadn't needed much convincing, not after Cal had described how an entire galaxy of riches and opportunity was waiting. When he learned that Cal and Mare would be joining in secret, he leapt at the chance. Chapter 180, Epilogue, Part 4. Chapter 180, Epilogue, Part 4. Operating under their new aliases, Cal and Mare meshed in rather well with the Caledonian settlers. There was a palpable excitement in the air of the city, and the Dyson sphere was always abuzz with the anticipation of finding a new home for humanity. Andromeda meant so much to so many people that it quickly evolved into something like a new paradise for them, a mythical Eden. Even the threat of the war couldn't dampen the spirits of the settlers. The Imperial Guard and house troops that would be expected to fight them were a different story. While the civilians made plans for settlements and new governments, forming alliances and forging relations that would see their colonies flourish or stagnate, the troops were spending every waking moment training. Merritt and Ella, who hadn't trained in a mesh since returning from the First Boer War, found they were rusty. It took them months before they were comfortable in their new mobile suits, and the lag was manageable. Each day, Merritt would return to their home exhausted and sore, all while wondering how he had managed to spend the entire conflict with the war in Atlas. It had been a miracle that he could remain awake from the neural burden. After a year, they were veterans of mesh combat once more. With their skills and abilities, they gained a place amongst the leaders of the Caledonian forces. Considered aces, their Valkyrie and Tyr would become the vanguard against the war when the time came. After a decade, everyone on the Dyson sphere and the flanking starships were eager to reach their new home. The city was excellent and filled with everything that humans could ever want, but there was something about standing on a planet that could never be replaced. Flo was busy during the trip as well. She and the other Titan pilots were placed together in a group for their training. Over 24 strong and hailing from every ducal house, it took them years to even learn to work together. After a decade, they were coordinated and capable, although there were still problems with some stronger personalities. Flo slammed the door of her locker, hitting it with her closed fist for good measure. Not satisfied with taking out her anger on an inanimate object, she turned around to her cousin. "He's an asshole. I don't care that he saved my father's life. Nothing gives him the right to treat me that way." Flo cursed as Catherine stood with her arms crossed, still wearing her pilot bodysuit. Catherine shook her head at the younger woman. Despite being in her 40s, Catherine and Flo could have been sisters of the same age. Both were beautiful and vibrant and shared the noble features of their houses of being a head taller than most other people and having perfect facial structures. The only contrast between the two women was their hair colors. Catherine had the blonde hair of Havencroft, while Flo inherited Mare's straight, jet black locks. Unfortunately, Flo hadn't inherited her father's temperament. She was more like her grandmother, Amara. Praxis may be unlikable, but he's got real experience in facing the war aboard a Titan. There was no one better to lead us to Andromeda except perhaps for Cal, and there was no way Argyle was going to convince your father to leave Caledon to come with us. Catherine replied. Praxis had volunteered to command the Titans during the expedition and developed a training program that he felt could best prepare them for what they faced when they reached Andromeda and once again came face to face with the Vor and their monarchs. Passing the earldom of Praxis to one of his children, Richard Praxis piloted a newly built Titan using a similar frame as the Prometheus that had served him well in the first conflict with the Vor. The only changes he had requested from Cal during its development were additional weapons to combat the monarchs. Unfortunately, despite his skill as a pilot and his experience against the Vor, many of those serving under him were having trouble with his methods. Flo had butted heads with the former Earl from the first moment they had met. Praxis had a habit of comparing her to her father, something that she despised. She wanted to be judged on her own merits and make a name for herself with her abilities. She knew her father accomplished incredible things, But she didn't need to be reminded that she would likely never meet the expectations others had of her when compared to Caledon. So do you. Why can't you take the lead in our training or even split the duties? Why does Praxis need to be the one in charge? Flo replied, her tone laced with frustration. Catherine sighed, running a hand over her face tiredly. It was the same argument they had for years, and each time, Catherine had to remind Flo of the reasons. The young woman could be heedless at times, not recognizing the pain that the reminder caused her cousin. Because Praxis is a better pilot than me. He had more experience, and his insights into fighting the Vor are second to none. I'm only here because Cal saved me. If I had been fighting alone, like Praxis had done, I would have died. Flo, I can't very well teach you what I know about combat when I relied on your father to protect me for most of that battle. Catherine admitted. Hyperion was lost, and the remains vaporized by the detonation of the original Dyson sphere. Catherine was piloting a replacement based on its model. As was an improvement on the original design. Cal himself had worked with her father to oversee its construction, using a combination of real-world experience and the AI Collective's knowledge to create a Titan that could be considered the pinnacle of weapon technology. But the problem with Mesh was often not the design or construction but the pilot inside. Catherine had decades to try and process what happened, and it had led her to volunteer to join the expedition to Andromeda. She wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't the scared and helpless person she had been when she first fought the Vor. Cal had told her she had nothing to prove, that she had performed superbly against the Vor, but the fact remained that he had to rescue her in the end. Since then, Catherine had worked hard to improve, and her connection with the Titan EOS was second only to what Praxis had with Prometheus. It was why she was currently the second in command of the Titan pilots. I've seen you pilot, Catherine. I doubt even my father could defeat you in a spar. He may have been talented once, but he hasn't been inside a mobile suit in decades. I don't know why Praxis constantly compares him to me like he would be a better pilot. Father admitted before I left that I'm more skilled than he was at my age. Flo bragged as her anger faded. Your father hadn't even been in a mobile suit until he was 20 years old, Flo. Catherine muttered, but the young woman wasn't listening. This was how their conversations typically went, with Flo having an emotional outburst and Catherine just calmly waiting until it passed. We'll be arriving in a few months, and I'll show them. The Vor won't know what hit them. Flo promised. Page break. I yield. Emperor of Mercy, Merit. I've never seen anything like that before. I'm glad you're on our side. We need people who have fought the Vor before. One of the Imperial Guard soldiers shouted as tyranned the Imperial Assault class Mesh to the ground. Cal's cover story was that he was a former Caledonian house guard who had followed Caledon to the Dyson sphere as a medium-class pilot. He had fought the Vor before being wounded and transported to one of the starships. Things had been hectic during the operation, and even the other veterans often didn't know who was fighting next to them. It allowed Cal to seamlessly become Merit. You're doing well. Just remember to watch each other's backs. The Vor will pick off isolated Meshs one by one. You should always have a partner to cover each other. Merit advised, stepping back and allowing Tyr to power down. I'll keep it in mind. I can't believe you all fought on the Dyson sphere without anywhere to retreat. I hope the Vor doesn't arrive in Andromeda for a few decades, and we can have our defenses ready. The guard replied, I hope so as well. Chapter 181, Epilogue, Part 5. Chapter 181, Epilogue, Part 5. The conflict with the Vor ignited on the borders of colonized Andromeda space, scarcely 5 years after the Dyson sphere and the fleet of starships arrived on the edge of this new galaxy and only 15 after they had first left the Milky Way. Alexander had been conservative in his estimates. He had incorrectly assumed that the mysterious object that remained after fleeing from the destruction of the AI Collective's vessel operated similarly to their own engines. Contrary to expectations, the Vor arrived in Andromeda after a mere 35 years of travel. Worse, the hive that had mainly been stripped away from the hardened core by the detonation of the Dyson sphere's artificial sun had mainly been restored. Like a dark star descending from the heavens, it approached a colony on the furthest reaches of settled space. Planet Nera, a dusty rock that was just beginning the terraforming process and home to only 2,000 people, was lost in the first wave of Vor. While they were picking the planet clean of life and harvesting the bodies of the dead settlers, a message was broadcast to the rest of the galaxy, the warning a last act by the brave men and women as they defended their new home. The Titans were the first to arrive, a dozen strong and at the lead of a rapid response strike group made up of 1,000 starships. With nearly 200,000 meshs, the Vor on the planet were obliterated from orbit by flights of bomb-carrying assault ships guarded by flying mobile suits. But the Vor had learned from their first encounter with humanity. They would not allow human ships, meshs or large objects near the surface of their hive. Unlike the first war, the Vor were not shaking off the effects of their long slumber. The appearance of humans immediately provoked them. Hundreds of millions of Vor appeared from the hive, taking to space with an ease that put the greatest of space-capable mobile suits to shame, forming a barrier that prevented anything from approaching the hive. They launched themselves against the Imperial forces, and at the forefront, half a dozen monarchs led, their psychic powers forming an impenetrable barrier as they closed with the Titans. Human technology had advanced significantly since their first encounter, and so had the destructive power of their weapons. Meshs vaporized entire swathes of drones, and guided missiles sought out the stronger soldiers amongst the Vor, targeting them before they could get close. Assault craft weaved their way through the battlefield, their energy weapons clearing a path for the slower-moving meshs. But humanity was outnumbered in this fight, and even with all of their training and preparation to face the Vor, the Titan pilots were stunned by the aggressiveness and complete disregard for causalities that the Vor had. Flo panted with exception as she followed Catherine closely. The Pleiades was based on the Atlas design and carried out a similar kind of attack. Waves of intense gravity confused and disoriented the Vor, allowing the mobile suits under her command to pick them off quickly. Celestial devastation was a draining and exhausting attack for its pilot to use, and all of their training told them to conserve their strength for a prolonged conflict. Their goal was to decrease the Vor forces enough so that a strike team carrying a new type of bomb could reach the surface of the hive and detonate it, causing an explosion similar to the detonation of the Dyson sphere. The bomb was essentially a modified starship with an oversized engine that would detonate on command but required meshs to move it and set the command to detonate. "Watch it!" Catherine shouted through their communication channel. As flashed in front of her, its speed increasing instantly so that it seemed to teleport. Stabbing a Vor soldier that was about to fire on Pleiades, it moved on to the next target. "Keep your mind focused, Flo. It only takes a moment for things to fall apart." Catherine chastised Flo. Luckily, the monarchs were focusing on preventing the fleet from reaching the hive, leaving the Titans to support the regular troops. If Flo had lost focus while fighting a monarch, it would likely have been the end of the young woman. Shaking off her errant thoughts, Flo threw herself back into the battle. Page break. An alert went out to all the newly settled colonies of Andromeda. Cal and Mare, living as Merritt and his wife Ella, were in New Caledon when the announcement was made that the Vor had been spotted. Unlike the Titans who were assigned to the Rapid Response Fleet, Merritt and Ella were still a part of the Caledonian House Guard, meaning they would be required to fight but would report through their own chain of command. Merrick Dan was acting governor of New Caledon. The Terra-like world had been one of the first habitable planets they had found, and the powerful ducal house had laid claim to it. "We'll need to mobilize our forces. We're looking at possibly a day before we can bring in all our equipment and prepare the starships," Talhu advised. The Rapid Response Fleet would be responsible for either stopping the Vor dead in their tracks or, at worst, slowing their assault long enough for reinforcements to be mobilized. The settled systems has no idea how long it would take the Vor to arrive. It could have been decades or longer before the hive reached Andromeda. This was a compromise to allow the settlement to continue while providing security. Cal and Mare stood in the governor's office, a beautiful building overlooking a pristine sea on New Caledon. For the settlers, as much as they loved Caledon, this new planet was already feeling like home. "Ella and I will lead the Ezra Titans against the Vor. 500 meshs will be enough to buy you the needed time," Merritt replied. "Those meshs are pseudo-Titans at best, Merritt." Talha looked at the other people in the room, choosing her words carefully. Wearing his pilot bodysuit and helmet, no one aside from herself and Dan knew his true identity. They may lack the unique abilities of the Titans, but their reactors are just as powerful. What we lose in strength, we make up with numbers. We'll drive the Vor back. Merritt promised, and Talha was stunned at the bold declaration. She would have thought it was just a boast if she hadn't known his true identity, but Cal knew what the Vor were capable of. If he was confident that 500 of Caledon's Titans could make such a difference, who was she to argue? Very well, your starships are ready to bring you there. Good luck, everyone. Talha agreed. As much as she wanted to stop or join him, she knew she lacked the ability to handle one of the meshs. Her responsibility was to oversee the mobilization and defense of New Caledon. Cal had personally selected the pilots for the Titans, not just from amongst the Caledonian sector but the entire galaxy. Many were former Imperial Guard who had fought on the first Dyson sphere and whose experience there had elevated their abilities. After a decade of intense training, they were ready. Merritt led the ground to 3 starships in orbit above New Caledon, bearing the Caledonian Red Stag on the sides of ships. 500 meshs jumped to planet Nera. Page break. Florine Caledon was in trouble. Pleiades was being driven back, and even the additional support from Oz couldn't give her the break she needed. The Vor were evolving, and she could see it happen in front of her eyes. Whatever technological advancements humans had made that gave them an edge in the beginning were being countered quickly. She saw soldier variants devouring dozens of drones to increase their size and strength to the point where they could stand face to face with an assault mesh. It didn't seem possible that the Vor, who appeared to be mindless beasts, were on the verge of defeating the Empire. A streak of orange plasma shot out from an oversized soldier's cannon-like appendage situated on its turtle-like back. It was joined by dozens of others as the large object it was approaching drew closer. The Vor had released gigantic, manta ray-like beasts to carry their forces close to the human meshs. With a form of artificial gravity, these creatures could hold hundreds of thousands of Vor. Worse, it affected the space around them, drawing in meshs and ships with its gravity. Pleiades dodged what it could before a stream of superheated plasma struck its shield. The temperature of the cockpit increased, and the overtaxed environmental systems made a squealing noise as they tried to compensate. Chapter 182, Epilogue, Part 6. Chapter 182, Epilogue, Part 6. Flo couldn't fall back. The Vor were pressing the attack on all sides, and the Titans were the only thing keeping the entire line from collapsing. In front of her mesh, below and above, soldier variants were raining burning plasma onto her mobile suit's shields. Her Titan glowed like the sun, absorbing what energy it could and converting it to its own use. But there were limits to what even a Titan could do. There were too many, spaced too far apart, for her to destroy quickly. Pleiades struck back where it could, using devastating gravity attacks to counter the worst of the assault, but it was apparent to Flo that even with 24 Titans, they couldn't make up for the incredible gap in numbers. And unlike humans, the Vor were replenishing their ranks without end. Beside her, Catherine's Oz was doing its best not to be caught in Vor's press. Even her hyperspeed was being countered by the Vor's attacks. Like a net, they were using energy fields to cut off her escape, forcing her to act in an area that shrank with every moment. She lashed back like a trapped rat, striking where she could, but she was steadily losing ground against the Vor. Landing on one of the manta-like creatures, Ursa, the Titan of Aeron slammed its weapon down against the flesh of the beast. Despite the lack of atmosphere, a shockwave emerged from the hammer, spreading out and blasting away all its nearby foes. The Titan was covered in black Vor blood from its rampage. Lucky for Ursa, the vulnerability of its systems to the Vor's infection had been eliminated decades ago, leaving it free to run amok without fear of contamination. Ursa's ability to build kinetic energy in its frame and weapon could be used to devastating effect, evidenced by the floating remains of the Vor that it left in its wake. It shredded its enemies, ripping and smashing through them with an unmatchable ferocity. Next to it, Pax of Castillo, the unassuming and plain-looking Titan, shot at the defenseless Vor in front of it. Pax had been created to counter mobile suits, generating a unique energy field around it that interrupted the neural link between pilot and machine. After the first battle with the Vor, its abilities had been tweaked to include a disruption to the Vor's thought processes. The closer to the mesh that the Vor drones and soldiers came, the slower they reacted until they seemed to close their eyes and fall asleep. The peace pacts granted to its enemies allowed the Titan to efficiently dispatch them. Finishing off another soldier variant, Pax took off to the next group while Gargantua of the Armada fired a salvo of missiles against the Manta that Pax had incapacitated. The Titans worked well together, working in concert to eliminate their foes. Pax would disable the Vor, while Ursa and Gargantua eliminated them with ruthless efficiency. Gargantua was created to unleash destruction on its enemies. With more weapon systems than any other Titan, it overwhelmed every foe to face it. Until a monarch arrived. The towering monstrosity that was the pinnacle of Vor evolution appeared out of a swarm of covering drones and soldiers. Before Pax could respond, a spear of psychic energy pierced its cockpit, gouging a hole through its thin armor. Pax was a support mesh, not designed for full frontal encounters. It relied on its abilities and the support of other meshs to perform. Against a surprise attack by a monarch, there was nothing it could do. With that, the first Titan fell. With a scream of rage, Ursa launched itself at the monarch. Its hammer filled with stored kinetic energy swept toward the seemingly defenseless creature. Holding up its forearms, it formed a psychic barrier of protection that slowed the hammer's descent. Unbridled brutality. The young pilot of Caledon shouted, her voice filled with rage as the Titan influenced her personality. The stored kinetic energy began to enhance the Titan's physical strength, and its frame filled her cockpit with creaks and groaned from the strain. The hammer, stationary under the monarch's superior powers, began to inch its way toward its unprotected head. Concerned that it was losing the contest with the Titan, the monarch let out a psychic scream that carried across the battlefield. Its body began to vibrate, and its flesh bulged obscenely. Retreat! The Armada pilot shouted as he fired a ray of crimson energy at the monarch. It pierced the torso of the Vor, punching a hole clean through, but the barrier that had been repelling the descending hammer was now forcing it to remain. Too late. Ursa sought to release the hammer, only for the monarch to explode before it could escape. Acidic black blood covered the Titan's body, swiftly eating away at its armor. In seconds, the cockpit was exposed, and a streak of burning plasma from a nearby Vor soldier ended the Caledon pilot's life. Screaming with rage at the loss of two of its allies, Gargantua fled, all while firing wildly into the mass of approaching Vor. Page break. We need to retreat. This planet is lost. We can't slow their advance if we're all dead. Alexander advised his brother. Argyle was the leader of the Andromeda expedition, but the strategy against the Vor would come from the young prince. His sins against the Empire had been hidden from the public in exchange for his help against the Vor and his exile to Andromeda. The battle had been going well, but their assumptions against the Vor had led them to fatally underestimate them. They had assumed that the Vor would be significantly weakened by their first encounter, leaving them a shadow of their former power. They hadn't expected them to recover so much on the journey to Andromeda. Where had the Vor obtained the resources to rebuild their forces? Had it been contained within that strange orb that had escaped them all those years before? We've lost another Titan. A crew member updated them, adding another to the list of causalities. They had lost 7 Titans in the last half an hour, along with tens of thousands of meshs. The Vor had evolved their tactics, flanking and cutting off their forces. They needed to withdraw now or risk having to leave some of their troops behind. Sound the retreat. Get everyone back here before Argyle was cut off by a warning alarm blaring throughout the command center. Unknown jump signature detected. The ship's computer communicated, and their sensors showed a distortion in front of their starships. Reinforcements? They're too early. We weren't expecting them for hours. Alexander wondered, had he been wrong about their response as well? Alexander had estimated that it would take hours, if not days, to gather reinforcements from amongst the settlements. With fresh troops, he could throw back the Vor, resupply and rearm his battered forces and delay the Vor for even longer. The jump portal formed in the midst of the 1,000 starships, well back from where the fighting was taking place. Safe and secure in the rear of their forces, they were acting as a repair and resupply point for the conflict. The distortions grew stronger, indicating that it was a significant force emerging from the jump. Alexander estimated that it was at least 100 starships, possibly led by Titans. If the sensor readings were accurate, he felt a sense of relief. Maybe they would be able to pull off a victory here yet. The crew were hopeful throughout the command center as they watched their screens. expecting to see reinforcements emerge. That hope turned to horror as a half-dozen Vor monarchs led an army of millions through the jump. The creatures had learned much since their last encounter with humanity, especially about their tactics. It didn't matter how many Vor attacked them. Humans could flee in their starships at any time, denying the Vor what they sought. But without their starships, they would not be able to flee. The last image Alexander had was the resigned look of acceptance and regret on his brother's face as the command center collapsed around them. With an explosion that lit the darkness of space, the starship exploded as the monarch crumpled the starship with its psychic powers. Page break. Flo watched in horror as the starships detonated in great flashes of white light at their rear. She could hear the screams on her communication channel until she finally disabled it to spare herself from the noise. 1,000 starships, their only means of escape, had been destroyed in minutes. Chapter 183, Epilogue, Part 7. Chapter 183, Epilogue, Part 7. A crushing sense of despair swept through Flo, drowning her in its depths. The detonating starships shined brighter than the sun of the planet they orbited, and each flash of light was another nail in their coffin. There would be no escape now, not for any of them. Still, the humans endured. They fought against the endless tide of Vor, and with each moment they resisted, another Titan fell, and another section of their battle lines retracted. They were being surrounded now, assaulted from all sides by the Vor emerging from the jump. Praxis shouted with anger, slicing through a line of Vor with a lasgun from Prometheus' improved weapons. But he wasn't able to save Oceanus. The Titan of Tish fired off a final salvo of pure blue light that burned through a monarch before it was swarmed by Vor. Cursing in frustration at the loss, Praxis pulled his Titan back while sweeping the battlefield with another crimson line of energy. They were losing badly, and unlike when he fought them on the Dyson Sphere decades ago, there would be to fleeing this battle to fight another day. He hadn't anticipated they would jump behind their lines to strike the starships. It wasn't a tactic that humans would use. The jump disrupted shields and the systems of mesh for a few moments, making them vulnerable to counterattacks. Evidently, the Vor didn't have the same limitations. He hadn't even been aware they could jump. Their monarchs had never displayed that ability in the past. Perhaps it was another evolution on their part. Contract the line. We hold for reinforcements. Praxis ordered, and the remaining Titans pushed closer together in order to cover the entire battlefield. But the losses were mounting, and they were stretched thin. Pleiades crashed onto the back of a Vor Manta. Its broad back had become a home to both humans and Vor as they fought across it. Her shields had failed, and Flo's cockpit had warning notifications across the terminal and her HUD. The reactor of the Titan sputtered, interrupting the whining noise it had taken to making as it was being battered by the Vor. Before evening out once again, the machine was at its limits, as was its pilot. She was filled with regret as she watched the monarch drift slowly toward the surface of the Manta toward her. Catherine was gone, separated from her during the fighting. She didn't know if her cousin lived, but she hoped she had survived. One of them needed to make it home alive. She regretted how she had left home and how she had treated her parents. Flo had just wanted to strike out on her own, to make a name for herself without the shadow of her father robbing her of her accomplishments. And now she was going to die without ever seeing them again, without apologizing for how she acted. Her father had tried to warn her about the Vor, about what they were capable of, but she hadn't listened. She thought he was just over-dramatizing the war to keep her from joining. She couldn't believe how foolish she had been. "I'm so sorry," Flo whispered to her parents' memory as the monarch raised its hand and pointed at her Titan. She could feel it gathering its psychic energy to strike. The cockpit rattled around her as she tried to move it, but the systems weren't responding correctly. Flo couldn't escape what was inevitable. From the side, a streak of crimson energy a dozen feet in diameter burned a hole through the monarch's head. Not satisfied, hundreds of knife-like feathers slammed into its torso, gouging out holes in the Vor's body before returning from where they came from. What? Flo stammered, confused at the events as the monarch collapsed onto the ground. "Are you all right, Flo?" A familiar voice spoke through their communication channel. A mesh landed on the ground beside her. Lithe and winged, the mobile suit carried a long spear in its hands while feathers black with Vor blood returned to its outstretched wings. A person appeared on her HUD, and Flo was stunned to see that it was her mother. "Mela, Duchess of Caledon, was here in Andromeda. Mother, what are you doing here? Flo exclaimed with a mixture of confusion and relief. Caledon was a decade and a half years travel away. How was it possible that she arrived to save her? Had her mother been on the Dyson sphere without her knowledge? It's all right. We're here. We're going to get you all out of this. Mary assured her daughter. Flo whispered as another mobile suit hovered in the space above them. Its weapons were glowing as it unleashed streams of energy and laser fire at the Vor with supernatural accuracy. It single-handedly drove back the Vor around them, a feat that even Flo and Catherine working together had not been able to accomplish. Protect Florine. I will lead the assault against the Vor. Everything will be fine. We are here. Caledon stated, his voice carrying over the universal channel all across the battlefield. Humans were stunned at the proclamation. Caledon, who had been instrumental in defeating the Vor during their last encounter, was here with them again. Flo watched as hundreds of meshs in similar designs as her parents' models shot toward the Vor. With an unstoppable momentum, they carved their way through the creatures with their weapons. Everywhere these monsters appeared, the Vor died, and the human battle lines solidified once again. The starships are destroyed, but they are not needed. We will never surrender, never retreat. Cal shouted his encouragement as he obliterated another monarch with the help of one of the other Titans. He was incredible. His skill with the mobile suit was unparalleled, as he seemed to be everywhere at once. Any time it seemed that the Vor would overwhelm their lines or push their way through, Cal was there with a group of his pseudo-Titans. Soon, it was the Vor that were falling back toward the hive. Even with their endless numbers, the Caledonian reinforcements were able to crush everything before them. 500 pseudo-Titans were turning the tide of battle, but it still wouldn't be enough. Soon, reactors would run out of power, pilots would tire, and ammunition would deplete. They needed to strike a decisive blow before the momentum changed once more. Arm the explosive. It's time to finish these abominations once and for all. Cal ordered, and Praxis grinned as he had Prometheus led a group of meshs in arming the device and leading it forward. The starship-sized bomb had been halted in the center of their forces, unable to move forward against the tide of Vor. With Cal in the lead, the Caledonian pseudo-Titans punched a hole in the line of Vor. Clearing a path, Praxis and his soldier pushed the bomb toward the hive. All the while, the crazed Vor tried everything they could to stop them. Casualties mounted, and more Titans fell. The Vor destroyed thousands of meshs, but in the end, the massive explosive was placed on the hard surface. Guarding it for a moment as the modified engine began to thrum with power, Cal ordered his forces to retreat once it was ready. The explosion was not nearly as large as what he had witnessed on the Dyson sphere, but its proximity to the hive meant that it was equally devastating. White light burned away everything it touched, vaporizing the Vor forces and the surface of the hive. Unlike the first time the hive was destroyed, this time, the explosion drilled its way deep beneath the surface, forming a gaping hole in the hive once its light faded. Like a wound, black liquid filled the bottom of the cavity, and at the deepest part, it touched upon the impenetrable surface of the orb that had escaped them. Not willing to let the same thing happen again, Cal ordered his forces to attack the orb with everything they had. Hundreds of thousands of streams of bluish-white lasgun fire, crimson PPC energy and missiles struck the surface of the black orb. Despite not making a dent, it gradually heated from black to bronze until it glowed white-hot. It was finally punctured when Prometheus used a concentrated blast of energy in the center of the orb. A gushing geyser of black liquid exploded out of the sphere, floating away into space as it emptied. For the first time, Cal and the others saw what lay at the center of the Vor hive. Chapter 184, Epilogue, Part 8. Chapter 184, Epilogue, Part 8. The subsiding, ink-like liquid revealed a pale and humanoid figure. Compared to the size of a hive, or even a mesh, it was a minuscule thing. The corrosive black substance that could eat away at a mobile suit's armor drained away from the creature's flesh, leaving it naked and shivering. Cal watched as it slowly stood on two legs, and he was drawn to its face. It could have been a human, its features androgynous and lacking agenda. The creature was unaffected by the void of space. Whatever atmosphere had lingered in the hive had been destroyed in the explosion. What is it? Praxis asked, and Cal could only shake his head at the question. Cal wouldn't have questioned its presence if this being had appeared on Terra or any other human colony. Was this a new Vor created as part of their species evolution? Why was the entire hive constructed to protect this single, tiny creature? It looked lost and confused as it searched the gathered meshs and titans hovering in the space above it. Cal had no idea what it looked for, but it obviously didn't find it. It grew visibly agitated, and a sinking feeling of worry built up in Cal's stomach. Retreat! Cal shouted as an eruption of psychic energy shook the remains of the hive, spraying black liquid and bits of debris in all directions. Space shook around them, and Cal's mind was filled with a screeching sound like fingers on a chalkboard. A piercing noise blocked all other sounds from Cal's ears. All around him, meshs began to shut down as their pilots clutched their heads in agony. The noise was ringing throughout his cockpit and his mind simultaneously. The strange being had its mouth open in a silent scream. Its head tilted backwards as its shriek affected every human in the vicinity. It was a power beyond what even the monarchs exhibited, and Cal struggled to block it. Even his neural link with the Terra was being affected, the neural burden increasing with each moment. Soon, he would be unable to do anything, and the pseudo-titan would be unable to obey his commands. The strange creature lacked the fine control that the monarchs had, but its abilities were beyond comparison. The psychic attack of a single, diminutive figure stymied the strike force responsible for driving back hundreds of millions of Vor. Cal tried desperately to push past the mental assault, seeking to finish this monster before irreparable harm could be done to the people around him. But even with his experience in piloting and the frequent mental incidents with Atlas and the Vor, he couldn't overcome it. His mind was filled with images and sounds, rapidly moving in a nonsensical fashion. Cal couldn't piece any of them together, and, at first, he had assumed they were just random sensations the creature was using to attack his mental defenses. But as the assault continued, they became more precise. They told a story, one that Cal had trouble believing. He saw Terra, the birthplace of humanity. Its surface was scarred and polluted, nearly unrecognizable from its glory during his lifetime. The image shifted, and he was on a barren field. The remains of destroyed meshs and other weapons of war were strewn about him as far as the eye could see. A group of humans were standing together. They wore strange uniforms with unfamiliar sigils and medals on their chests. A flag flew above them, a map of Terra with blue laurel leaves around it. Dozens of people from different backgrounds and ethnicities stood facing another group. This second group was humanoid but wore pilot bodysuits with their faces covered. There were only a few figures, but Cal could recognize the terror and respect that the humans had for them. They lacked a flag or a common symbol, but Cal knew who and what they were when one of their group stepped forward and removed its helmet. It was an envoy. Cal could see the resemblance to the poor creatures he had seen on the Dyson sphere. They had similar features, the artificial skin and eyes that weren't quite human as they glowed with an intense, inner light. The way the being walked forward while the rest were entirely still screamed to him that they weren't natural or human. From the humans, a person walked forward and shook the hand of the envoy, and Cal knew what he was seeing. The peace between the AI collective and humanity after the AI war. Cal thought. The scene shifted, and Cal was back on the Dyson sphere. Artificial beings walked the city streets, and Cal could feel the sphere moving through space. Like flowing water, the image carried him along until he was in a laboratory of some kind. A group of AI envoys were standing around a strange device. A small, insect-like creature floated within the glass confines of a large cylinder. Cal could read some of the holographic images around the lab, but one word stood out to him. Vor. The AI collective created the Vor. Cal whispered in his mind, and the images changed again to a memory of utter carnage. AI technology clashed with the Vor in a familiar scene to Cal. He watched as the Vor's psychic virus infected them. Again and again, Cal watched the memory repeat, with minor changes each time. And Cal came to another understanding. He wasn't watching the same memory repeat, it had happened many times. There was more than one Dyson sphere. More than a single hive. Cal stated with shock and horror. Knowledge poured into his mind, and all around him. Other men and women experienced the same thing. The AI collective created the Vor in order to reach the next level of evolution. The AI were digital beings. Without experiencing physical reality, they would eventually stagnate. The VOR were designed to evolve quickly, allowing the AI to study their evolution, but their creation turned on them. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of hives in the universe. Cal thought. The psychic scream from the strange creature continued, and Cal could see its similarity with the envoys. Traces of their shared heritage, humanity's heritage. The scream was cut off as a streak of crimson energy vaporized the creature, and Cal followed it back to its source. Prometheus stood in the darkness, glowing as bright as the sun, as Praxis slowly lowered his weapon. "You saw the same thing I did. Where these bastards come from?" Praxis asked, switching to a private channel with Cal. "Our work isn't over. I don't know if it will ever be over." Cal replied, "Page break." Talhasan, along with representatives from all of the newly settled colonies, led a force of tens of thousands of starships to assault the VOR hive. They were prepared to rescue a beleaguered group of defenders or avenge the dead. They hadn't expected to find Cal and the others amongst the wreckage of the VOR hive, slowly picking off the few disorganized VOR that remained. It was a great victory for humanity, and Talha had expected to see her friend and everyone who had fought here to be celebrating when they landed on her starship. What she hadn't expected was haunted looks and grim faces from Cal and the others. Talha could understand when he relayed what he had seen, what they had all seen from the strange creature in the center of the hive. It was inconceivable and horrifying. There were more hives out there in the depths of space, waiting to devour them all. But there was hope as well. They had defeated this hive, and Cal assured her that if any others attacked Andromeda, he and the others would destroy them. Humanity would not be defeated. Page break. Flo fell into her mother's arms, feeling like she was a child again as she cried in happiness and relief. The terror of the battle was fading, and she wanted nothing more than to forget it. She didn't care that others were staring, even when Catherine joined them, wrapping her arms around Mare and Flo. They would have stayed like that forever if a voice didn't intrude on them. "Are you all right, Flo?" Cal asked, and his voice broke through their emotional reunion. Wiping her cheeks clean with the back of her hand, she stepped back out of her mother's arms to look at her father. Wearing a Caledonian pilot bodysuit, with his helmet held under his arm, he looked competent and composed. She knew that he had seen the same thing she had, the same images of the VOR's creation and the slaughter they had both experienced from fighting them, but his presence reassured her, giving her some of that calmness she always felt in his company. Her father was here. Everything was going to be fine. Chapter 185, Epilogue, Final. Chapter 185, Epilogue, Final. Cal set foot on Caledon once again after nearly 5 decades away. Breathing in the crisp morning air, he looked in satisfaction at his estate. It was stunning how much had changed since he had returned from his time in stasis. He remembered how the planet was nearly in ruins, the environment polluted, and the citizens oppressed and bereft of hope. Seeing the beautiful vista of the city, the flourishing gardens and clean, blue skies put his heart at ease. Coming off the shuttle, he was greeted by thousands of people. He recognized many of them, and their happy expressions told him everything he needed to know about how they had fared while he was away. Walking up behind him, Mare tucked her arm through his as they walked forward through the crowd. A part of him wished Flo were with them, but she had elected to stay in New Caledon to oversee the settlement and train with his forces there. But, while one child was still away, another was waiting for them with a smile on his face. Emeritus had matured while they were away. Wearing a Caledonian houseguard uniform, Mare was struck by how similar he was to his father. Her son was nearly a twin to her husband when they had first met. Engulfing him in a hug, the family retreated to the estate to reconnect and spend time together. Page break. "I don't know why you requested this thing to be delivered here, Father. It seems silly to have a reminder occupying the room with you. I thought you would want to forget your time in stasis." Emeritus spoke, walking around the stasis pod with a frown on his face. The family was gathered in the throne room of their palace, staring at the piece of equipment that Cal had retrieved from the recently decommissioned prison where he had once spent 500 years of his life. Cal sighed, running his hand along the glass of the pod. "It's good to have a reminder of the cost of your actions. Someday, when I'm gone, and you are Duke, I hope you will retain it as a keepsake to your children." to teach them that arrogance has a price, and not just for themselves but for others around them. Cal's voice trailed off. How would his life have changed if he hadn't been consigned to stasis? What if he had been allowed to inherit immediately? What would Caledon have been like? Would Cal have been able to fight the war, or had his experience hardened him and prepared him for what was needed? He would never know. Page break. I understand that this is a lot to ask of you, Duke Caledon, but I honestly can think of no one better to lead this expedition. The Emperor asked in private. They were on Terra Firma's 100th birthday. The years had been incredibly kind to the Duke and Duchess, their appearance not even closely matching their age. Handsome and healthy, Caledon was in the prime of life. Combined with his experience with the war, he made the perfect person for the Emperor to ask. The settlements in Andromeda were flourishing to the point where they were discussing independence rather than fight it. The Emperor had embraced the sentiment the universe was large, and forcing humanity to serve a single person seemed a ridiculous and meaningless notion. And if we do find them? Cal asked, gripping the arm of his chair tightly. I would prefer you negotiate with them. Ultimately, we are responsible for what they did. We created them, and they made the war. We should work with them to correct this mistake, not fight amongst ourselves. They had picked up signs that the AI collective was not dead, as previously believed. Faint transmissions were picked up by deep space probes sent to find the war. Their purpose was to alert the Empire if the war were approaching and had found remnants of the AI instead. Please, Caledon, there is no one I trust more to see this done. Augustus asked, and Cal was surprised to hear how tired the Empire sounded. He was too young to appear so old and grey, but the throne had not been easy for him. His son, a scion of the Carmichaels as well as the royal family, was poised to take over soon. 500 years to get there, 500 more to return. You won't know if I succeeded. Cal reminded him. The trip was long, much further than the Andromeda galaxy, requiring everyone who was traveling to either stay in stasis or live their entire lives on board a Dyson sphere. Unlike the stasis used for punishments, these would grant the user sleep, sparing them from the torture that Cal experienced. Their minds would not be awake and aware of everything around them. Cal shuddered at the remembrance. If you're going, then I'll have faith that you succeeded, Augustus stated, and Cal could hear the man's trust in him in his tone. Cal nodded at the words, agreeing to the Emperor's request. Page break. Cal watched the pod close over Maya, sealing her inside. She watched him momentarily as the stasis systems engaged before her eyes closed, and she fell asleep. I'll see you in 500 years, Cal whispered, placing his hand on his wife's pod gently and running his fingers over the cold surface. Turning away, Cal went to his own stasis pod, where he pressed the necessary buttons to set the timer. Watching the lid close slowly, he thought about what awaited him. He would see his children once again, someday, along with Caledon enclosed in the pod. He could only hear the faint beeping as the mindless computer counted down. Cal closed his eyes. 500 years to sleep, to dream of halcyon days. The end. Caledon's Fall by T.G. Parsons.